So hey anime fans, the series name is What If Naruto Married Kushina? So let's start the series. The girl shuddered in his arms and he instinctively reaffirmed his grip on her. The trees were racing by as he leapt from branch to branch, finding the fastest way back to Konoha. She was no hindrance. Despite being famed for her sturdiness, Kushina Uzumaki was actually quite small for her age. Fragile almost. When he held her like that, he couldn't help but be amused by the sheer amount of willpower and confidence hidden beneath that gentle frame. Now, of all times, she was most vulnerable. Fortunately, the Kumobikyu Nin hadn't harmed her, apart from a few bruises and scrapes she must have inevitably received on the way. However, she was highly dehydrated and overexhausted, and her skin felt cold and clammy to the touch. He was certain that anyone in her place would be unconscious by now. Overpowered by the weariness and the stress of the situation, she, however, despite being too still and pale, was awake and alert in his arms, resting her head on his shoulder slightly as if unsure whether the physical contact was acceptable. Her stamina was impressive, but he found himself unsurprised. He had always known it, and told her as much not more than 10 minutes ago. She was strong. They hadn't spoken much since. Apart from her asking a few quick questions about her parents, he didn't mind the silence. It wasn't uncomfortable as it might have often been. It was a silence of trust. She trusted him to do the right thing and was content to be in his arms, being carried back to safety, and he was content with that trust. Minato looked down to make sure she was still conscious and met a pair of curious eyes studying his face. The reassuring smile appeared on his lips before he knew it, and she reluctantly replied in kind yes. She trusted him, but she didn't know him and this proximity was new to her. He should change that, he thought, and talk to her more often. Surprisingly, she had been left with the impression he didn't like her. He pondered over it for a few minutes. He had never treated her antagonistically, unlike a large part of their classmates. But he had to grudgingly admit to himself that he hadn't shown his good opinion either. He couldn't shoulder all the blame. Kushina had kept everyone at a distance. But how could he blame her? If he was so scorned, he might have reacted the same way. She might have been strong. Yes, but she was also a child, like him, and this must have hurt her. He was dragged out of his reverie as he felt the approach of 2 other ninjas on either side of him. His body tensed automatically, calculating the best defense, vaguely aware of the alarmed look that Kushina gave him at the sight of his narrowed eyes. 2 Inbu appeared on either side of him before he could decide on a next course of action. Racing through the trees in pace, he felt himself relax infinitesimally, easing up his pace just as he noticed the nearest of the 2 masked men putting away a kunai. He was wearing a monkey-shaped mask to conceal his face. Minato could feel, rather than see, their stern gazes fixing on Kushina. Is the girl hurt? The monkey asked, not unkindly. No, but she is exhausted and dehydrated. I am taking her to the hospital. I'm fine, you know. I could have walked this myself, you know. Her vexed voice was weak, however, and utterly unconvincing. The monkey nodded towards the other Anbu before he disappeared into the trees, most likely alerting the others that Kushina had been found. I will escort you to the hospital. Under whose orders are you operating? Minato frowned. He knew it would come down to this. No one's orders, sir, he answered carefully. I came after Kushina in my own free will. You are aware that this was an A-class mission with possible international consequences. It wasn't a question, nor an accusation. He had stated it evenly. As a fact, Minato nodded, feeling Kushina direct a frown towards him in her own turn. The Anbu looked ahead in silence, sparing him the questions that would probably be asked later by someone else. They were coming up to the village walls when Minato saw him up the path and paled. For the first time since rescuing Kushina, he came to a stop and a nervous apologetic smile appeared on his face. The plump green frog, no bigger than his head, was not buying it. You are in serious trouble, Mina-chan, he said, baiting eyelids to worry me and Jiro-chan like that. Forgive me, Gamariki-san, he said, inclining his head. You can let Jiraiya-sensei know that both Kushina and I are safe. I have to take her to the hospital before I meet him. Kushina was giving the frog incredulous looks, her face frozen in a mixture of surprise and half-hidden horror. Minato had to wonder what was shocking her more, the talking frog, his female attire, or the names he tended to use when referring to him and his sensei. Perhaps a mixture of all 3. The Anbu stayed indifferent, giving no sign of impatience. Yeah, but be careful, Mina-chan. He's most irritated. he said with an exaggerated sigh and disappeared with a poof in a cloud of smoke. Kushina looked at him in disbelief. One of Jiraiya-sensei's summons, he explained with a sigh as he started moving again, entering the village. The sentry stationed there took one look at the ANBU accompanying them and waved them in without a word. The blonde boy glanced at Kushina again as she chuckled. The smile tugging at the corner of her lips was in no way innocent. Mischief flickered through her eyes before she looked away. She would never drop it. He realized, mortified. As far as she was concerned, he would be tagged Mina-chan in her books for every jibe. He felt color rising to his cheeks and inwardly cursed Gamariki's timing. As tired as she was, Kushina had her dignity. Upon arriving at the hospital, she shrugged out of Minato's arms before he could parade her through the main entrance like a ragged doll. She underestimated her own exhaustion, however, and her legs gave in to her weight as soon as they touched the ground. She never fell. Minato's arms caught her and steadied her before the ANBU could even react. He had been expecting it, but he might as well have gone and explained to the nearest wall that it needs his help before any such words would reach Kushina Uzumaki. He sighed and slipped her arm over his shoulder, supporting her weight. Always the fighter. Can't return you the compliment, you know, she retorted in a pouty manner. Surprisingly, it amused him even further. Her free hand brushed a lock of fiery hair from her face absent-mindedly as they walked towards the door. His eyes caught the movement, and he smiled, trailing her long mane with a look. How anyone could make fun of it was beyond him. Her hair was beautiful, tangled as it was after the incident. It turned out they were expected. ANBU's instantaneous network of informants working wonders. Tsunade-sama swept forward as soon as they entered the premise. Kneeling before Kushina and touching a hand to her forehead, behind her stood the current Jonin commander, whom Minato recognized only as Shikaka Nara's father, and the Hokage himself. It's okay, you can let her go now, I will take care of her, Tsunade-sama said quietly, and he realized he had been holding firmly onto Kushina, not releasing his grip. Kushina didn't seem the least happy about being parted from him either, which only proved his earlier observation that she had indeed grown to trust him. He had to suppress a smile at the thought. Oh yes, of course, he said sheepishly and reluctantly stepped away from the girl as Tsunade picked her up perhaps too gingerly and carried her down the corridor, only stopping to assure Sandaime that Kushina was okay and would make a quick recovery. The monkey-masked ANBU with Minato took this chance to hurry before the Hokage, dropping on one knee before him and explaining briefly how he had located Minato on the way back. The boy couldn't help but feel a cold drop of sweat trickling down the back of his neck as both the commander and the Hokage directed a look at him. Minato Namikaze-sa? Why am I not surprised? Sandaime said mildly. There was a twinkle in his eyes, a speck of good humor in his look. So this is the Minato-kun I keep hearing about. My son tells me you give him a run for his money where shogi is concerned, the black-haired man said through a smile, arms crossing against his chest before turning back to the Hokage. To think a genin would do better at finding her than your own men, Sandaime-sama. I have no doubt that Minato would be willing to enlighten us about that particular feat as soon as his wounds are treated. I'm not wounded, he replied, and could see the man's eyes widen in surprise. Oh? You mean to tell us you bested a Chunin and got out without a scratch? 2 to be precise, and a Jonin. We have already detained them and escorted them back to the TI headquarters. They all live, the masked ANBU interceded, voice carefully void of any opinion on the matter. Silence followed his words, blanketing the quiet hospital entryway as Minato bore their stunned looks stoically. Well then, Sandaime said quietly, if you are truly well and unhurt, Minato-kun, and if you don't mind, I would invite you to my office. I'm afraid I will have to deprive you from a good night's sleep for a little longer until we appease my friend's curiosity. And my own, for that matter. Of course, Hokage-sama. Sandaime dismissed the ANBU shinobi and turned to leave the room, followed by his advisor. Minato padded after them, throwing one last look down the corridor where Tsunade had disappeared with Kushina, wondering when he'd get to see the fiery girl again. The Hokage's office was large, but even so it seemed strangely stuffy with all the people inside, Sandaime's advisors now having joined him and the Nara clan head. Hiruzen Sarutobi had seated himself at his desk, the others standing about haphazardly, eyeing the blonde genin with looks varying between amusement, surprise and open distrust. So Sandaime began, knitting fingers over his desk and favoring Minato with another kind smile. I would very much like to hear of tonight's events, if you will, Minato-kun. I was at Ichiraku's earlier tonight when the distress signal was given, he started slowly. I saw a group of shinobi gathering, directing civilians to their homes. One of them was Tsukumo-sensei. Upon mentioning Kushina's sensei, he paused before damning thrice in his mind. He should be careful who he mentions. He didn't want to cast a bad light on Hatake Tsukumo in any way. After all, the decision to go after Kushina had been his alone. Sandaime, as if having read his precise thoughts, smiled again. I'm sure Tsukumo-san directed you home as well. Minato's eyes relaxed and he couldn't stop himself from returning Sandaime's smile, albeit briefly. Yes, he did. He seemed distressed and I asked him if I could help. He informed me that there had been intruders in the village, whose current location was unknown. So people were directed to their homes as safety precautions. I asked if there were any casualties and he responded that no one was harmed, but they were dealing with a missing nin. Minato paused again, lost for words. He couldn't easily explain what had followed. He had asked Tsukumo who it was, but the Jonin had shaken his head, the expression in his eyes, the way his shoulders slouched, the way the corners of his mouth dropped ever so slightly, had been enough for Minato. He had learned how to observe and assess. He didn't inform me about the missing nin's personality, but I understood. As her sensei, he was personally distraught, Minato said slowly, choosing his words with care. He instructed me clearly to go home after that. I defied his orders. The boy's voice rang clearly as he said the last words, looking at each one of the elders in turn, as if challenging them to blame him for it. Kushina Uzumaki is my friend. She is a fellow shinobi of Konoha and I personally felt obliged to try to help her instead of waiting at home, he continued unperturbed. The Hokage sighed. Such is the fire will of Konoha. No shinobi can stay idle when a friend of his is at danger, even if that means defying direct orders. There was no accusation in his voice and the now familiar smile was tugging at the corners of his lips. I do not believe we can hold this child at fault for rescuing a comrade. Do you not agree, Danzo? The man gave Minato a slow appraising look before finally nodding. That still doesn't answer our question as to how he located her. When all of our teams were at a loss, the Nara had interjected with unhidden curiosity in his voice. The enemy might not have been good fighters, but they covered their trails expertly, leaving no trace of scent or chakra. Minato smiled, recalling how he had glimpsed a little strand of fire, half hidden by leaves and twigs on the forest floor. How his heart had skipped a beat as he got nearer and confirmed that this was indeed her hair, this unmistakable, beautiful rich red, that he remembered would whip around her face as she lashed out proving herself every day. The Hokage's words suddenly rang through his mind again. He was right, Minato knew, he would always try to help a comrade when help was needed. But was this the only reason he had gone after Kushina? The heat stung in his cheeks. No, it wasn't. What had he told her? I didn't want to lose you. It was true, the possibility of her being torn away from the village, from him, before he even had the chance to know her, somehow pained him in an inexplicable way. I followed her hair, he said quietly. For once looking at his feet, Kushina is very brave and smart. She plucked strands of her hair and dropped them without her captors noticing. Her hair is a very beautiful color. I noticed it right away. I just followed the trail. Once finished telling this, he finally looked up. To his surprise, Sandaime was chuckling and even the serious-looking Jonin commander had cracked a smile. Minato smiled too. And pray tell, how did a genin of Nu defeat 3 grown ninjas, a Jonin amongst them? Danzo cut through. His smile never left his face. I took them unawares. They had reached close to their borders and they were growing reckless, thinking they were safe. Also, I'm kind of fast, he said sheepishly. If you expect us to believe, and what would your explanation be, Danzo-sama? A 12-year-old boy was cunning enough to trade Kushina Uzumaki off Kumobikure? Jiraiya's voice snapped so suddenly that Minato jumped and took 2 steps sideways instinctively, never having felt his sensei appear behind him. Danzo's eyes narrowed. What is this farce, Hiruzen-sensei? Jiraiya demanded in a serious manner, rarely witnessed by Minato, a child, being interrogated by the entire council after having saved his comrade from the hands of the foe? Minato Namikaze is a prodigy amongst genins. You must know as well as anyone else, he is more than capable of handling 3 grown shinobi. He is my student after all, the Sannin finished, letting a grin spill on his face. And with that Minato was suddenly no longer alone, in that cold room, before the questioning eyes of those strangers, even if a pair of them was full of kindness and understanding. Sensei, I will deal with you later, Brat Jiraiya growled quietly, silencing Minato with a chilling look. He suddenly remembered the pain written on Tsukumo-sensei's face when he had thought Kushina was in danger. Guilty conscience gnawed on him. He should have called his sensei before dashing in the woods alone, no matter how confident he was in his own abilities. Jiraiya, Sandaime started with a sigh. We were in no way interrogating young Minato. As far as I am concerned, he is a hero today, having completed an A-rank mission excellently at the age of 12. On the contrary, his success intrigues me, as well as my advisors. Your pupil is insightful, resourceful, and skillful. You should be proud. No retributive measures will be taken against him today in gratitude for saving the life of a Konoha shinobi in danger. However, I will kindly ask him, as a friend, rather than Hokage, to heed orders in the future and attempt to solve problems within their limitations. With an ingenious mind like his, I am sure he will find a way. And Sandaime smiled at the dumbstruck Minato, who was staring at him in disbelief. He wasn't the only one. Danzo also had a hard time containing his disagreement. The rest of the elders, however, were nodding somberly. Yeah, well, you see, Jiraiya started through wide grins, scratching the back of his head nervously, having found himself suddenly praised as a sensei. His sudden mood swing didn't surprise Minato. He was very much used to it. Therefore, his sensei's next action was almost anticipated. Almost, his hand lashed out and smacked Minato on the back of the head. You pinhead! He snapped, apologized to Sandaime immediately. Sensei! Minato half-shouted as he instinctively reached up, trying to rub the sting away. I apologize for the trouble caused, Sandaime-sama, he recited dully, eyeing his sensei with annoyance. No, not at all, Minato-kun. I should be the one to apologize for keeping you here for so long. I believe with this you are free to go. However, I must remind you that I will expect a full report at the mission's desk tomorrow in order to validate your first A rank. Now, Shikadai, please find Inokin and direct him to TI. I would like him to personally take care of the attacker's interrogation. I want a full investigation report as soon as possible. If the rest of you would remain, I would like to discuss some adjustments to our security system. His voice faded as Jiraiya-sensei put a hand on Minato's shoulder and led him out of the room. He didn't miss the cold look Jiraiya exchanged with Danzo right before exiting the room. The wind blew steadily, picking up their hair and clothes. Minato had always enjoyed it. The top of the Hokage mountain having turned into one of his favorite places in Konoha ever since Jiraiya had taken him there first. The white-haired man was silent and Minato didn't dare talk before his sensei deemed it appropriate, glancing in the general direction of the hospital absent-mindedly. She is going to be alright, she just needs rest. She was still awake when I saw her, Jiraiya said with a sigh, having guessed Minato's center of attention. You saw her? Gamariki-san was under the impression that you would be at the hospital with her. For such a small brat you sure do cause significant problems, having to abandon my research to look for my runaway student. Jiraiya was complaining with a pouty look. Sensei, you said yourself that you believe I am capable of. Stupid, Jiraiya said through annoyance, smacking the back of his head again. Minato gave a yelp of pain before clutching the back of his head with two hands, mumbling about sudden mood swings. As if to prove it, his sensei sighed again and looked ahead with a serious face. You are a capable shinobi, Minato. The boy's eyes directed at him, silently. His somber, teaching voice was something Minato didn't hear often, but had learned to respect and acknowledge. But you are reckless, his sensei continued, shaking his head, and in times like ours recklessness costs dearly. You are not arrogant, of that I am sure. You are confident in your abilities as you well should be. But you underestimate the enemy's potency. What if they were 30 shinobi, not 3? You are quick, I'll grant you that, and smarter than I ever were at your age. But a shinobi's true power doesn't hide in the body or in the mind, he said and moved a heavy palm to his chest. It lies here. Your friends and family, your comrades, everyone that you love and trust, and everyone who answers you in kind. Never forget your teammates and your teachers in such times of peril. You would have stopped me, Minato mumbled, looking away in certainty. Damn right, I would have. This is a fight between villages, brat. They needed Kushina alive and well. But if you had gotten yourself killed, it would have sparked off a new war between our nations. It might still be so, mind you, despite having left those shinobi alive, Jiraiya grumbled, throwing a quick glance at the Hokage tower in the silence that followed. Sensei, why did they need Kushina? The white-haired man nodded eyebrows and remained quiet for a while. Kushina's chakra is different. Because she is an Uzumaki? Yes and no, Jiraiya said carefully. She has vast quantities of chakra because of her clan abilities. But even within the Uzumaki bloodline her chakra is amongst the most potent. She is quite special. That friend of yours, he finished, his lips twitching with a slight grin. So she might be targeted again. Is this what it meant being strong? She might well be, if our enemies know about her potency. I will protect her, Minato said sternly, and Jiraiya lifted an eyebrow. Not if I can help it, you won't, he growled. Sensei, if it hadn't been for me. Save me the heroic monologue, brat. I had picked up her trail already before Gamariki-san appeared. Kumogakyo would have never had her. Oh, was all Minato managed before smiling nervously. Just how daft do you take your sensei to be, ah? Jiraiya said before his face stretched into a wide grin. You need to trust me more when it comes to such delicate matters. The boy's look returned to him questioningly. Delicate matters? His sensei laughed cheekily, giving Minato a light elbow shove in the ribs. You know I am proficient with the ladies, he said with a wink. Jiraiya-sensei. Minato scoffed, feeling his cheeks burning yet again, finally having understood what his sensei was implying. Hee, you have an eye for them, Minato. Kushina will grow to be quite a beauty. You must have learned from your sensei. Good. Saving her like that must have made her notice you. But you have more to learn. Jiraiya was reciting through an even larger grin, while patting Minato frantically on the back as if acknowledging a successful mission. And no, it's nothing like that, he said, pulling away from his sensei's encouragement and shaking his head. She's my friend, that's all. Boy, you have more growing to do before you can lie to your sensei. Your face is as red as that damned girl's hair. Minato stumbled for words that never came as Jiraiya reached out and wrapped a grisly arm around his neck, pulling him closer, ruffling his hair with his other hand. Come now, tell your sensei all about her. Sensei! Wood creaked loudly as Kushina planted another well-measured kick at the training post in Training Field 3. Sweat was dripping down her forehead and neck, her face flushed from the effort, her muscle ached from the repetitive movements, a burning feeling indicating that she was reaching her limit. She had been hacking at the wooden log for the good part of an hour now, venting rage and exasperation. Not yet, I can still. She directed a high kick at the post, and then another, wood splintering where her foot made contact. A hiss escaped her as one of the splinters scratched her leg, leaving a burning red trail. Her legs were trembling, breath coming out in rough pants. It had been 2 days since the incident, and she still hadn't seen Minato. She had left the hospital early in the morning the following day, escorted by her parents who felt that she would be safer at home. She had to roll her eyes at the thought she had been kidnapped from home in the first place, yet she didn't mind. She had already recovered completely during the night. She had always healed at a rapid rate ever since. She shook her head, casting the thought aside. As boring as hospitals were, being locked up at home wasn't any less tedious, so Kushina had taken it up to the training grounds. What started at first as a mere distraction soon grew into an exhausting training marathon, a new passion driving her movements. The blond boy's smile, his smile, would often flash before her eyes and her cheeks would burn hot from the training efforts. He had praised her and acknowledged her in a way no one had before. Because I know that you are strong, both in body and spirit. Rumors of his own skill had spread all over Konoha in no time, some of which quite exaggerated, telling of his bravery and strength. The prodigious child, they all called him in praise. Another punch and the log creaked. She wouldn't let herself fall behind him. Not now, when he had acknowledged her. Now, of all times, she would train and catch up to him, and next time she would be the one helping him. A snigger from behind her drew her out of her reverie, and she whipped around instinctively, still breathing hard. Her stomach clutched uncomfortably at the sight of the boy standing there. She had seen him before, and more unpleasantly she had hit him before, a couple of times. After being mercilessly called tomato 4 days on end, the genin was grinning mockingly, one hand holding a bag of kunai. He had come to train. Well, if it isn't the tomato, he said with a sneer, obviously noticing her exhausted state. What's wrong, tomato? Appears someone else almost plucked you. You didn't beat up those men, did you? Shut your mouth right now. I would have beaten them bloody, you know. Oh, were they weaker than the wooden log? Since it seems to be giving you such a hard time already. Kushina clenched a fist and took a step forward, ignoring the burn in her muscles. I wouldn't do that if I were you. The familiar voice startled her and she stopped in her tracks, turning abruptly to her right. Sure enough, he was there, kneeling in the branches of a nearby tree, watching the other boy through calm blue eyes. This reminded her of a similar incident not too long ago, when she had noticed him observing yet another confrontation of hers. That time, however, he hadn't interfered. Her eyebrows furrowed with annoyance. Had he forgotten his own words? Why was he butting in now? Is that you, Namikaze? You better listen to your new bodyguard, Tomato, if you don't want troubles. I wasn't talking to Kushina-san, Minato said calmly, jumping from the tree before the girl could say anything. I meant that I wouldn't bug her if I were you. A warm smile spread across his face because she would kick your butt before you know it. Kushina's eyes widened for a fraction of a second before she grinned, stomping ahead with clenched fists. Leaving Minato behind her, the genin seemed to reassess the situation, his eyes quickly jumping from Kushina's angry face to Minato's calm smile and back to the nearing form of Kushina. Whatever, not like I want to get my hands dirty, he said a bit too loudly and turned to leave. Coward! The girl cried out after him, waving a fist, but the boy didn't flinch, stalking away as if highly uninterested. A soft chuckle from behind made her turn around. He was still there, she noted, realizing suddenly that she had half expected him to disappear. He didn't seem the least worried by the situation. Leaning lightly against the tree from which he had jumped, hands in his pockets, the same warm smile on his face. This time, however, there was a nervous tint to it. Perhaps this was as awkward for him as it was for her. After all, they hadn't really talked much before he had rescued her. Kushina quickly ran a hand through her hair absent-mindedly. Your hair is beautiful, so I noticed it right away. What are you doing here? She blurted out, the first thing on her mind. A stupid question. It was the training grounds. What else could he be doing there? His answer, however, surprised her. I was looking for you, he said quietly, that smile never leaving his face. Tsukumo-sensei said you would be here. Looking for me? She blinked surprised. Minato's smile turned even more nervous as he scratched the back of his head absent-mindedly. I went to the hospital the following day, but you had already left. I wanted to see if you were okay. Her eyebrows furrowed as she threw him a testing look. I'm fine, I told you back then. I didn't need your help, you know. She walked away from him, going closer to the stream next to the training ground and kneeling next to it. It was her favorite training area because it provided all of the field training situations that you could encounter. A water field next to an open meadow, surrounded by a thick forest. You could prepare for anything. Her hands scooped water and splashed it on her face, washing away the sweat and grime from the training, refreshing her senses. She sat back with a huff and closed her eyes, pulling her long hair over one shoulder, allowing the wind to caress her bare heated skin. She felt him approach before she heard him. He was quick and quiet as it appeared. With one light move he sat down next to her, eyeing her wordlessly. Let me guess, you think I'm pushing it and that I should be in the hospital recovering? She asked through annoyance, to which he smiled and shook his head. I think I wouldn't be able to force you back there even if I wanted to. His voice was warm and honest, there was a calming lilt in it. Finally she gave up the disinterested attitude and turned to stare at him openly. His manner was friendly and his stature relaxed. He really was at ease with her. The setting sun was playing colors with his hair, turning it a richer gold than usual. He was like a little sun himself, she thought through amusement, seeing the warmth in his face and the smile with which he answered her scowl, those light blue eyes that couldn't hold anger. She felt her cheeks warming up before she looked away, choosing to follow the sun, the real sun, instead of trying to read his face. You're pretty good, he said after a few seconds of silence, and she turned a questioning look at him. Your moves are really swift and powerful. I like your fighting style. Why are you doing this? She demanded through a scowl. What do you mean? This, you're being kind, first my hair and now my fighting style. Why? He sighed. You have a problem with compliments. It wasn't a question. I'm fine with compliments, you know, she said a bit too loudly, twisting a lock of hair through her fingers, the true ones anyway. The last part was a mumble, but it made him sigh again. In one swift move he was up on his feet and facing her. She looked up in surprise, her eyes falling first on his warm smile and then on his outstretched hand. Come on, let's train, he said lightly. I'll show you that my compliment wasn't a wasted one. She blinked before a grin stretched across her face. With exaggerated slowness she placed her hand in his and allowed him to pull her off the ground. His hand wasn't soft, on the contrary, it was already too callous for that of a child, the result of countless training with kunai and shuriken, chakra molding and climbing. He was a true shinobi. I'm not gonna hold back, you know, so you better not slack off," she shouted as she took her stance 20 feet away from him down the meadow, kunai in one hand. He smiled and took his own stance, wasn't planning to. Kushina appraised him with a long look, trying to decide how to go about this. She was still tired, but the short break had somewhat revived her senses, easing the ache in her muscles. She wasn't going to lose to him anyway. Of all people, she wanted to prove to him that she was truly strong. He wasn't smiling anymore, his face carefully wiped of emotions. Good, she thought smugly, he is taking me seriously. He was waiting patiently across the field, intent gaze on her, calculating the opponent's strengths and weaknesses. Analyzing, he was good at that, she suddenly remembered and scowled. Could he read her right now? She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. With that she charged, head on, aiming for a high cut to the chest. Minato blocked it with a kunai of his own, sidestepping her, trying to stay out of her field of vision. She had expected it, however, and her body shifted fluidly in his direction, trailing his movements while pivoting on one leg, the other already brought up for a side knee kick in his ribs. He, however, seemed to be anticipating her moves as well, as he twisted his kunai hand, sending her own weapon flying behind her, and then brought down an arm to block her kick before she had even neared him dangerously enough. "He's quick," was the short observation that crossed her mind as his parry turned into offense, his other hand aiming for her exposed chest while still blocking her sidekick. She cursed inwardly as she dodged by jumping backwards in a cartwheel, her hand wrapping around the hilt of her fallen kunai as it touched the ground. Minato didn't waste any time. As soon as her feet touched solid ground he was off again, dashing at her irregularly. He was a worthy opponent for a spar, insomuch that his fighting style was quite different than her own. While she kept a firm step and aimed rapid punches and kicks, relying on intensity, he was light-footed, swift and quick, dancing about her at an impressive speed. If she was fire, he was wind, and just like the wind fanned the flames, so did his sure, swift attacks rile her up. Desire to win thrumming through her with each next move. Her hair whipped around her as she blocked and dodged, suddenly pressed on the defensive while he kept coming at her in irregular intervals, intercepting her moves. They were flowing from one stance to another, anticipating each other's attacks. Blunt kunai clashing audibly in the still meadow, she was certain that he could read her moves better, already having adopted an altered fighting style to better match her own. She grunted as she dodged another swift, well-aimed punch at her exposed side, moving away from him and running down the riverside instead, knowing that he will follow. He did not disappoint. She heard his light steps as he dashed after her, gaining on her with little difficulty. A wry smile ran across her lips as she ran straight at the tree from which he had observed her earlier, and didn't stop. Her momentum carried her upwards as she gathered chakra at her feet, running up the bark at full speed. As Minato reached the same spot she was already jumping, pushing herself back in a somersault in the air. Minato rooted to the spot, whirling around, putting his back to the tree to anticipate her landing behind him. Her next move, however, caught him completely off guard. Instead of planting her outstretched arms on the ground and continuing into another cartwheel to steady herself, her carefully measured somersault carried her for an aerial attack straight at his figure. Startled, he leaned back in a crouch, but was unable to dodge her entirely as her hands landed on his lower thigh, her hair spilling below her as she propped herself head down, aiming a swirling kick straight at his face. Her unusual attack earned her a surprised hiss as Minato barely managed to lift his hands before his face to block her kick. As quick as he was, his block was clumsy and the momentum of the kick saw him flying sideways, losing balance and falling in the river with an audible splash. Kushina had already jumped away from him, landing in a threatening crouch on the bank. "What's wrong, Mina-chan? Too agile for you?" she said through a grin as he rose, water dripping from his clothes, and to her immense satisfaction his eyebrows furrowed at the belittling name. She couldn't help the smirk. A vexed opponent was a distracted opponent, and one that didn't react well to surprises on top of that. When he dashed at her again, splashing water about, she blocked him and stepped back, feigning a head-on counter-attack before planting her foot firmly on the ground in front of him instead and swirling around. Her hair whipped around her, blocking his sight of vision as he pressed his attack. She noted his eyes widening before she rapidly dropped down in a crouch, stretching a leg out and continuing to turn around. With a swoosh she swept his feet off the ground, causing him to fall back with a thud. "Aha!" the girl shouted victoriously, rising up again and pointing a kunai at the boy. As soon as she met his eyes, however, she understood that something was wrong. He was smiling a warm, apologetic smile. Sorry, he mouthed before disappearing into a puff of smoke. What was all she could say before she felt the cold kiss of steel at her throat. Her eyes widened, Kagebunch, and she breathed, her eyebrows furrowing, but when an image of Minato splashing in the river appeared before her eyes and she cursed him inwardly, that sly bastard. She could feel his heavy breathing behind her. The fight had dragged on longer than he had expected. He was at his limit, as was she. But she wouldn't lose to the likes of him, not after such vile trickery. In one quick move she grabbed his kunai hand and moved it to her mouth. Minato was too surprised to react, and before he knew it her teeth closed around the side of his hand. He yelped in pain and jumped back quickly, holding his hand up and throwing it a startled look. Kushina turned around to face him too, her hands on her waist and a scowl on her face. You bit me, he said incredulously, alternating glances between his hand and the fuming girl before him. You actually bit me. And with that he started laughing. She stared at him, surprised in her own turn. Stop laughing, you know, she shouted, her hands balling into fists. I'm sorry, it's just that, you bit me, he was saying in between gasps, starting to bend forward, clutching his stomach with laughter. Stop laughing at me. And with that she ran towards him, planting two hands on his chest and pushing him back, hard. He didn't even attempt to dodge it, choosing to fall back instead, continuing to chuckle while sitting down. In a few moments his laughter eased and he directed a merry look at her. You really are something else, you know, he said through pants, his breathing still not back to normal after their spar. Kushina felt her own exhaustion creeping over her as she smiled at him, her anger having vanished with his sunny smile. Her feet were trembling and fresh fire was coursing through her muscles, her own breath coming out hard and rushed and causing a stitch in her ribs. She carefully plopped down on the grass next to him, throwing a glance at the horizon where the sun had already set. The first stars were starting to appear and she lay back on the soft grass, eyeing the small specks of light. What do you think they are? She murmured, stretching a hand straight up as if to catch them. The boy stayed quiet for a while. My mother once told me that they are the spirits of our ancestors, watching down on us from the next plane, he said quietly, an undertone of sadness in his voice. She bit her lip. I'm sorry about your parents. He sighed and turned to look at her, a warm smile on his face. Don't be, they died as true shinobi, protecting their people. It's how they wish to go. I'm proud to be their son. With that he glanced upwards at the stars too. I'm sure they are watching over me now. I'm going to make them proud too. One day I will make people acknowledge me and I will become a great Hokage admired by everyone. No way, you know. I will be the Hokage. She snapped up, directing a light punch in his direction. He chuckled. It's a challenge then, he said and smiled. I'll watch out for your bites. You're on. There's no way you're gonna win. If you fight like such a flake, next time I'll be the one saving you. To her surprise he laughed. I told you you're quite good. Her answer was a grunt before silence fell again, disturbed only by the sound of awakening crickets. Hey Minato? He looked at her questioningly, and she was grateful that the falling darkness hid her burning cheeks. Thank you, you know, for helping me. The familiar warm smile spread on his face as the wind picked up the stray bangs of his hair. Always. He was leaning on a tree besides the river crossing training field 3. On the other bank he could make out the two figures of his student and his new friend. They had sparred until not too long ago. Before settling for a break in the meadow, the sun had already set, and he could hardly make out their outlines in the fallen dusk. His companion sighed and Jiraiya glanced at him absent-mindedly before returning his attention to the children. He's a good friend for her, he pushes her forward. I've never seen Kushina try so hard at training before, the crouching silver-haired man mumbled, without taking his eyes of the two students. You've taught her well, Tsukumo. I've rarely seen Minato so pressed for air before. Her stamina is impressive. The other man grunted in response. It's not me who she should thank for that stamina. Jiraiya understood the remark and remained quiet. Any news? The Sannin shook his head slowly. The captors didn't know why they were after the girl. They were only instructed to take her and bring her back unharmed. That should explain the poor condition she was in. If they had known exactly who, or what, they had in their hands, they would have never treated her like that. Whoever gave them their mission was very careful not to reveal his identity as well. It was all conveyed through letters. Inoken couldn't get much out of it. A heavy sigh escaped his lips. Whoever it was, they are orchestrating this whole thing from the shadows. The Reikage is refusing to take responsibility for the captives, claiming them to be Nuknin for Kumogakure. He is being careful to avoid war for now. From what I heard, they still haven't found a compatible host for their bijou. He granted us permission to dispose of the criminals as according to our laws. All we can do for now is wait. Sandaime has strengthened the security around the village. She should be safe, Tsukumo. It was my fault that she got captured in the first place. I was supposed to protect her. Jiraiya scowled and shook his head. You are her sensei, not her warden. It's our responsibility, as Konoha shinobi, to protect each other. No harm will come to her, he said before a grin spread on his face. My stubborn-headed student has vowed to protect her after all, he said and waved in the children's general direction. Tsukumo Hatake couldn't help but smile as well. You're doing it again, Kushina-san. Minato's calm voice came from her lower right where he was sitting, observing her efforts. The girl gritted her teeth, deciding to ignore him, and closed her eyes to avoid distraction. Her eyebrows furrowed in concentration. A drop of sweat was coming down the side of her face as she attempted to mold the right amount of chakra. Her hands forming the seal before her chest. Her chakra stream was picking up, burning her hands with its intensity. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. She shouted and heard the poof as a shadow clone appeared next to her. Her eyes flashed open, searching for the result of her efforts. Her spirits quickly dropped, as she saw yet another imperfect copy, pale and ghastly, barely standing on its feet. The clone Kushina wheezed a few breaths before disappearing in the same puff of smoke she had appeared in only a second ago. The original Kushina snapped teeth with an audible cack as she clenched her fists, breathing heavily, her palms still tinged from the abnormal amounts of chakra she had put in this simple technique, which had, nevertheless, turned out unsuccessful again. She heard him sigh and decided to ignore him again, closing her eyes and taking the same stance, hands forming the seal before her chest. Concentrate, she chided inwardly, feeling her chakra pick up again. Kushina, his quiet voice broke through her wall of concentration, and her eyes snapped open to find him standing right in front of her with a serious expression. You are doing it again. You're overexerting yourself. I'm doing my best, you know, she said through a frown. His answering warm smile didn't surprise her anymore. I know, but you are not applying your efforts correctly. You are molding too much chakra. It rushes out with no control and disperses. In fact, with the amounts of chakra you have wasted like that so far, I am surprised you can keep this going. Your stamina is truly impressive, he said and smiled encouragingly again before returning to his serious look. But this technique is about chakra control before magnitude. You need to channel the right amount of chakra into the shaping of the clone. Your chakra needs to divide evenly between yourself and each clone you make. Once you get the hang of it, it will come naturally. Then it becomes a matter of stamina and chakra stocks. The more you have, the more such clones you would be able to produce with the proper amount of chakra channeled for each of them. Minato explained patiently for what appeared to be the 20th time. She had to admit he would make a fine teacher one day. He had the patience to deal with slow, unresponsive students like her, and repeat the same theory without a hint of annoyance. Anyone else in his place would have long given up trying to teach her a technique that she obviously sucked at. His explanation wasn't bad either. It wasn't his fault that her chakra control had always been so unstable. What are you, a walking textbook? I know all that. I heard you the first 20 times. You know, it's not like I'm not trying, it just doesn't work for me. She snapped, slashing the air with one hand. He was already shaking his head through her statement. That's not true. You've shown good progress. You've been at it for barely a day. I'm sure you'll get the hang of it. Don't give up. Just focus on your chakra flow instead of molding large amounts for now. Of course I will. I never give up, you know, she said through a grin, closing her eyes again and forming the seal before her chest, trying to concentrate. Small amounts, steady flow. She felt the familiar surge of chakra rushing forward and her breath caught as she fought quietly to suppress it and control it, split it evenly. A hand touched her shoulder, another placed gently at the small of her back. Her eyes flashed open again as she jumped at the unexpected touch, turning a startled look to Minato. Relax, he said through a smile, stubbornly avoiding her eyes. Straighten your back here. His hand pressed slightly at her back again, and she realized his face was flushed, a blush dusting the bridge of his nose. Don't hold your breath in. Breathe slowly and deeply. Chakra circulation comes from the breath. Yes, like that. His soft voice encouraged as the girl straightened her posture and pushed her shoulders back, her cheeks burning uncomfortably. It had already been a few weeks since the kidnapping incident, a few weeks that had proven to be quite different than the pattern she was used to until then. The biggest change was Minato. Instead of abandoning the contact after rescuing her, as she had imagined he would do, he had stuck at her side, always having a friendly smile to spare. It had started with their sparring meetings, first irregular and random as it was that they suddenly started visiting the same training field. Their training sessions soon turned into a pattern as they started meeting almost every evening out of missions. Their taijutsu quickly became in sync, both having gotten accustomed to each other's style and techniques. The next step was ninjutsu, and to Kushina's distaste Minato had very prominently excelled. Comparing his light step style to the wind hadn't proven to be too far off the mark, as he had proficiently demonstrated a variety of futon techniques only a few days later. To make matters worse, he was already attempting to master a second element, while she was still stuck at her first. As mortifying as the experience was, she had accepted at one point that she had to ask him for tips. Luckily, he had turned out to be more than willing to cooperate. His instructions were patient and calm, and she got frustrated with him more often than not, failing to comprehend how he could keep his calm when her rage was growing proportionally to her failure rate. Despite being often angry, in truth mostly with herself for being so inferior to him, Kushina had soon realized how much more mellow she was in his company. While her desire to outdo him kept driving her to merciless and passionate training, the distance and coldness in her behavior had slowly started to disappear. She snapped at him regularly and threw light punches in his direction every now and then, but he met them with a smile and a laugh. His calm demeanor had started to rub off on her too, and she had started smiling more. Before long she found herself chatting excitedly every time after their spar, telling him about her missions and her sensei. It was a new feeling, having someone else but her parents, who enjoyed listening and talking to her, someone to train with, someone to share with, someone to laugh with. She was starting to get to know him better as well. With each day spent in his company, his smile had already been a hint enough of what a positive and sunny person he was, affecting everyone with a subtle magnetism that seemed to radiate from him. Kushina observed through disbelief as his mere presence positively brightened up people's mood. He didn't seem to notice his own effect on others, however, or if he did he never basked in it. He was always calm and collected, preferring to observe than to interfere. And Kushina could see the perceptiveness hidden in his warm look. Despite his mellow character, she had on several occasions seen his serious side as well. It showed another side to him. He was strong. Apart from strength, he also possessed intelligence. Being well-spoken in many topics when engaged in conversation, his knowledge was unusual for that of a 12-year-old and often surpassed her own. But it was quickly explained when she caught him more and more often with a book in hand. She quickly concluded it was his hobby. Watching him smile slightly, lost in between the pages of yet another book. She herself didn't enjoy reading as much, but she loved listening to him recount tales of what he had read, his arms moving about calmly as he would try to paint a picture with words while they were lying in the grass in Training Field 3 after their spars. It felt as if she had finally, after all those years, found a friend. The world rang positively in her mind whenever she thought of him. She hadn't realized how much she had needed this sort of bond until she had formed it. Having suffered enough in the past, however, had initially made her shut herself away again when she had acknowledged to herself that she had started getting attached to the carefree boy. "You're avoiding me." Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second. Not having heard his approach, she turned to look at him before frowning and looking back ahead, over the rooftops of Konoha. Ironically enough, it was a sunset again. They always had to meet at sunset. She shifted slightly, bringing her legs up to rest her chin on her knees and wrapping two hands around them. How had he found her? The rooftops weren't a popular pedestrian area. Minato saw her lack of answer as encouragement, and went to sit next to her, much like the first time he had appeared in the training area. "I waited for you today, and yesterday, and the day before that too. Don't you want to train any more?" he asked lightly, looking ahead as well. The girl stayed quiet again. "What's wrong, Kushina-san?" The wind picked up, sending a gust of dust in her face, and she felt her eyes water. It made her angry, at the wind, at the dust, at him. "Why should I train with you, you know? When you train enough and become stronger you will leave as well, like everyone else." Everyone who ever smiled like that to me left. My brother and Sashi-sensei, even Mito-sama, you know, and now you want me to train with you and then you'll leave too. I know you will. Everyone leaves. her hands clenched into fists. Silence followed her words, an uncomfortable pause that stretched for far too long. Kushina-san, he said quietly, but she didn't turn to face him. Kushina, look at me, please. Perhaps it was his quiet voice, or maybe it was the sudden lack of honorific, her name coming out strangely intimate out of his mouth. Perhaps it was the plea that she had never heard him utter before. She turned an angry look at him, accusatory. She knew he didn't deserve it, because he hadn't done anything bad, yet she was already blaming him for the mistakes she feared he would make. For once he wasn't smiling, he looked conflicted. I'm sorry, he breathed. I'm sorry that I never showed you that you weren't alone. I have always considered you as a fellow comrade. Ever since you stood before our class and shouted out your dream. You have the same goals as me. We share the same dream, see? That makes us comrades. He frowned through half a smile. If I have to be honest, you were quite scary. You seemed so angry at everyone and so strong, but I always admired you for that very same strength. I know I am 4 years too late to tell you this. But Kushina, I am not leaving, believe in that, because, and he smiled, his warming, sunny, pure-hearted smile, because you are my friend. Friend? Yes, he was her friend, despite having slowly shattered the wall that she was building around herself. However, Minato had still kept a distance, giving her time to get used to him, time to learn how to trust him, time to believe that he won't leave, she thought. Now, after all those days spent contently in his distant company, for the first time he had broken that distance, allowing himself casual close contact. Kushina, are you listening? He asked calmly, breaking through her reverie as he moved to face her with one hand still lightly touching her shoulder. You are doing the opposite of what I said. Your breathing picked up. Take deep, slow breaths. I heard you the first time, you know. She snapped louder than necessary and shook his hand away, fighting her quickened heartbeat. She closed her eyes again. TSK. He wanted her to concentrate, yet he kept distracting her with his presence. But she needed his tips as well. It had been only yesterday that she had lost yet another spar. Because of his Kage bunshins, she was growing frustrated with the technique, while admiring him as well for having mastered it so well already. Its uses were numerous, as he demonstrated every now and then, coming up with new ways to trick her. Finally she had given up and asked him through burning cheeks to teach her how to do it. He had agreed with a smile, saying that he had actually wondered when she would ask, TSH, so self-confident. The efforts that she had spent on it ever since yesterday, however, had turned out to be far greater than she expected. She had already had problems with the Bunshin no Jutsu, but the Kage Bunshin was a whole new level of hell. She wasn't about to give up, however. If he could do it, then so would she. She could feel what he was referring to. She could feel her chakra stream responding with every measured breath she took, slowing down along with her own calm breathing. Very good, he murmured from somewhere near her, and she felt a tinge of pride as he acknowledged her efforts. Try it like this. Imagine your chakra flow as a steady river stream. At the end of it there is a dam. That is your hands, forming seals. It is up to you to control the speed and amount of water that leaks on the other side. Bring it down to a trickle. His voice was calming and she found it easy to picture what he was talking about. She could feel her chakra flows steadying. A trickle of water, controlled chakra flow. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. Poof. Kushina blinked, turning to eye the results, her lips already set in a triumphant smile. Her hands hadn't burned this time and her chakra hadn't picked up and raged out of control. Sure enough, next to her stood a perfect copy of herself in full color and health. The clone Kushina grinned victoriously and raised thumbs up. Yes! Kushina exclaimed, giving herself a high five. Minato chuckled and the girl directed her attention to him, raising a hand to point at him. Just you wait, Mina-chan, now I will be the one to kick your ass in fights, you know. Kushina-san, you can barely create one clone. He started through a nervous smile, but she cut him off. All right. This training is making me hungry. I say victory ramen. OS. The clone Kushina joined in happily. Minato, it's your treat this time. The boy kept whipping looks between the two grinning girls, his expression resembling that of a nervous examinee. Both of you? I mean you 2 times? Bastard, are you saying I am not worthy of ramen, you know? The second Kushina snapped, waving a fist at him. And no, of course not, Minato exclaimed, shaking his head quickly through nervous smiles and stepping back, hands raised up before him in a placating manner. The original Kushina sniggered. With a quick wave of a hand seal she dispersed the clone and stepped towards Minato, punching his shoulder lightly. Thanks, the smile came to her lips easily now in answer to his own. But you're still treating me ramen. A loud splash came from behind him as Tora threw yet another rock in the river below them. Minato was leaning on the bridge railing with a book in his hands, but his mind kept skipping out of the contents, and he ended up rereading the same paragraph over and over again. The other boys' impatience hung heavily around him. It was distracting at the least, annoying at most. With a sigh, Minato closed his book and put it back in his backpack. Splash! Another pebble ended up in the water, thrown with more force than the previous ones. Stop it already, Tora, you'll make a dam of pebbles before he shows up, Mikoto said through mild annoyance, voicing Minato's thoughts. I can't stand this anymore. He always does that. And if I am ever late, he makes me carry his bags as punishment. The brown-haired boy fumed up, eyebrows knitted in anger. We've been waiting here for more than an hour now. It's less than last time, Minato said slowly through a smile. Don't give me that mellow face, you weirdo. I don't get how you can stand so calmly around when he is being so disrespectful. Tora, don't talk to Minato-kun like that, Mikoto started quietly. Tora opened his mouth to retort back, but stopped midway through as a familiar booming laughter reached their ears. They all turned to look in the direction of the noise, following the steep riverside with its many small, cozy buildings. It was the leisure part of the small bathing town, where pubs, restaurants and small betting houses excelled. Minato and Mikoto both sighed at the same time, seeing their sensei make his way out of one such pub, red-faced and laughing uncharacteristically loud while shaking hands with a smiling woman. That too was nothing new, nor was Tora's reaction. Bastard! He growled, balling fists and taking a step towards the riverside. Mikoto's hands wrapped around his arm instinctively, holding him back. Don't make a scene, Tora, let's just go home, she hissed, planting her heels in the ground and yanking back with all her force. She might have yanked on a raging bull, for all the good it did. Tora took 2 slow steps ahead, literally dragging the poor girl behind him. Minato smiled softly while watching them. Tora might have been a boisterous loudmouth, but he was always fun to have around, and Mikoto's strict side that she used only with Tora, so very different than her usual quiet shy character, clashed well with the loud boy's behavior, making them an amusing sight to behold. By the time the brown-haired boy had managed to free himself from Mikoto's grasp, Jiraiya had already made his way to the bridge, still grinning widely. How dare you! You're more than an hour late. We had to stand here waiting for you while you were drinking sake with women? What kind of sensei are you? Aren't you supposed to be an example for us? Tora snapped angrily, his still childish voice picking up high octaves as usual when he got pissed. Jiraiya blinked at him a few times before placing a hand on his head and ruffling his hair. Sorry, I lost track of time, he said and laughed loudly, before sidestepping the boy and moving forwards. You always say that. You can't always lose track of time. You are simply disres. Mikoto's hand slapped the back of his head, cutting his sentence midway through. That's enough, Tora, stop yelling at sensei. You're making a scene, everyone's looking at us. The girl chided, glancing around nervously. Jiraiya, now having his back to both Tora and Mikoto, made a pouty face as his shoulders slumped, much to Minato's amusement. Why do I have to be stuck with the loudest of brats? He mumbled before turning back rapidly. Listen here, you brat, I was teaching you a valuable lesson. Hear that, teaching? Tora's expression mirrored Minato's internal skepticism, but while the blonde boy was having fun with the whole situation, Tora was still annoyed. How is being late teaching? He said in a somewhat subdued voice. I am teaching you patience, since you obviously lack it. Until you learn how to deal with it, I will be late every time. Jiraiya said with finality and grinned. Tora growled. Bullshit, this is not ninja training. You're supposed to teach us strong techniques and how to counter powerful enemies, not patience. Jiraiya's expression darkened and Mikoto took a step back. If you believe this is all there is to ninja training, brat, then we should go back to the bell test and start all over. You haven't learned a thing. Minato and Mikoto have both excelled while you remain just as ignorant. Minato sighed. He knew what his sensei was doing. If there was one thing Tora Otepi hated, it was being compared to others, especially being placed inferior to others, and especially to Minato. The boisterous boy seemed to have developed an inferiority complex around him. What made Tora different, however, was the fact that having his pride squashed in such terms only inflamed his desire to outdo Minato further. As expected, his reaction was fiercer than before. It's always about Minato, Minato Namikaze can do everything better than me. Well, just wait and see. I'll prove to you. I can be twice as patient as him. Tora shouted and trudged down the bridge past his team. Tora, Minato began, attempting to placate him, but the boy silenced him with an angry look. Just leave him, Minato. You know he'll cool down in less than 5 minutes. He always does that, Mikoto murmured, picking up her bags and preparing to leave. Jiraiya was grinning. Well then, let's head back to Konoha and report a successful mission, he said, and started after the fuming brown-haired boy, with Minato and Mikoto following close after. We won't make it back before sunset, Mikoto mumbled quietly. I'll miss dinner. My mom always makes the best tonkatsu damburi on Thursdays. My mouth is watering just thinking about it. Minato forced a smile, avoiding her eyes. I'm sure she will save you some. Yeah, of course. But it won't be as tasty as when it's steaming and melting in your mouth. Her face held a wistful expression that made Minato chuckle. I just wish we could have headed back earlier. We finished the mission 5 hours ago. Why did we have to stop through this town anyway? It's not like we were tired. Sensei had work here, you know, his research, Minato said nervously, having started to have suspicions about the exact manner of research his sensei was conducting. But I know what you mean. I had hoped we'd be back before sunset too. Suddenly Mikoto turned to him with a wide smile. Training with Kushina-san again? Yeah, I had told her we would probably be back today. But I guess I won't make it. I had promised I'd help her with a new technique she's working on. His voice trailed off as he thought about the cheerful redhead who would spend her entire afternoon training herself to exhaustion once again. His sensei had called him reckless once, but Minato was certain that this was only because the Sannin hadn't met Kushina personally. While the boy admired her strong will and her amazing stamina, he couldn't help but admit that she always overdid it beyond what was reasonable. When Minato was not there to keep her in check, the girl had the masochistic tendency to keep practicing until she dropped. An involuntary smile tugged at the corners of his lips as he thought of her, imagining her long hair flying messily around as she practiced her new technique. There was a certain beauty in the picture his mind was painting, and suddenly Minato had the urge to walk faster. Mikoto's earlier remarks had made him self-conscious, reminding him yet again that there was no one in Konoha who awaited his return. No one to cook him dinner and welcome him with warm words. No, a small voice in his head was saying, there is someone who will laugh and chat happily when I return, after scolding me for being late. She makes you smile, Mikoto said quietly, not bothering to ask if it was true. Warmth crept up Minato's cheeks without him fully knowing why, and he looked away from the black-haired girl next to him, afraid that she will take it the wrong way. Yeah, he mumbled, and decided his behavior was suspicious enough to call for further explanation. I was just wondering how she's faring with the technique. I hope she hasn't despaired yet. What kind of technique is it? She's working on the elemental ones, trying her hand at fire. She was set on learning the Gokakyu. I'm not sure if I can be of much help there. Fire's not really my element, but I've read about it, and my chakra control is better, so my tips are useful sometimes. He generally disliked talking about others without their permission, but he didn't feel bad about talking to Mikoto in this particular case. She was a rational person and a good listener, and above all she was kind. He knew that if there was one person from the academy who had never made fun of Kushina and who had accepted her for who she was, it would be pure-hearted Mikoto Uchiha. He was glad that he was assigned on the same team as her. They had managed to become friends over the months. He listened to her advice and she listened to his, and despite rarely sharing personal things, they knew they could trust each other about many a topic. Where do you train? Training Field 3 down by the river. Why do you ask? Minato threw her a puzzled look. Fire techniques are my clan's specialty, she said with a wink. I know the Gokakyu better than most. Maybe I would be of more help. Minato stayed quiet, surprised by her sudden offer. If that's okay, of course, she started nervously. No, that would be great. Kushina would appreciate it. Thank you, Mikoto, he said finally, returning her kind smile warmly. That's really most kind of you. Hey, no problem. It's not every day that I get to be more useful than the great Minato Namikaze, the girl said teasingly and stuck her tongue out at him. She sighed with exasperation, letting herself fall back in the grass with the heavy book lying open across her face. There was no use, she wasn't getting any of it, it made no sense at all. She heard him approach a few minutes later, sharp as always. The girl sighed, not even bothering to move. knowing that the progress she was supposed to have made until he showed up for their field training had been no progress at all. She was stuck in the beginning of the horrible book with no prospects of advancing further. Since you usually detest reading, I can only conclude that there's a book eating your face. Minato's merry voice came from above her and her annoyed growl answered him from below the book. And they say you are supposed to be perceptive, she mumbled without moving before lowering the book down to find him leaning over her with that usual warm smile illuminating his face. She scowled and growled again. I don't get it at all, you know. Those techniques don't make any sense, she whined and threw the book aside, rising in a sitting position. And what techniques might that be? Minato asked curiously, springing lightly next to the discarded book and picking it up. His swift moves no longer surprised her, nor did his sudden interest in possible new techniques. Her friend loved challenges. He glanced at the cover curiously. Fuinjutsu, he whispered before smiling again, your clan is renowned for their skills with sealing techniques. There are rarely Fuin users who can master them, he said mildly, returning to sit next to her, still holding the book. I know what my clan is famous for, you know. She snapped, it's just that it's so complicated. My father gave it to me, because it's only a month before my 13th birthday. He said it's about time I started learning our clan's skills, make the family proud. Apparently, at my age he was already nearing advanced level. But I don't get any of it, and this is barely more than the basics too, she vented, suddenly unable to hold her anxiety. I'm going to disappoint everyone. I don't even want to learn sealing techniques. I do just fine with punches, the girl said with finality and crossed her arms, a stubborn look on her face. Minato chuckled. You said the same when you started learning the Kage Bunshin, and yet you can make more shadow clones than me now, he said warmly. But I wanted to learn the Kage Bunshin. Why don't you want to learn Fuinjutsu? Because they are boring, you know. You can't know if they are boring if you can't understand them. It's boring trying to understand them, she mumbled with a pouty face. Since when does the great Kushina Uzumaki give up so easily? Minato teased through a smile. I haven't given up, you know. The girl snapped, throwing a punch in his direction as she often did. Why don't you try it, if you think it's so easy, Mina-chan? Okay, was all he said before opening the book and adopting a serious expression. What now? We were supposed to train, she said incredulously, not having expected him to agree at all. I am training Fuinjutsu, he said through a smile before returning to the book with a stern look again. Kushina grumbled something about Mikoto and quietly walked away. He furrowed eyebrows in concentration as he drew yet another circle of kanji, practicing a seal. It had been a little over a month since Kushina had challenged him as a joke to try to decipher the horrible Fuinjutsu book. 2 weeks, during which all he had dealt with was seals. At first the intricate symbols had confused him as well, but before long he had started making sense of the explanations, growing more and more fascinated with the beauty and hidden possibilities that this particular type of techniques offered. The user could do most anything imaginable, given enough time to prepare in advance. And even the limitation of preparation time needed seemed to be possible to trump, if one held mastery over a seal and could apply it with a touch. The book that Kushina had given him grew more and more intricate with each following step, explaining a variety of techniques from different masters. He had progressed slowly at first, going back to the basics of it many times to reconfirm different theories. But his pace had gradually picked up as his understanding of the delicate techniques deepened. He ended up finishing it within 4 weeks, his new passion having driven him restless until he knew more. By the end of the book he had acknowledged that the majority of sealing techniques in it were original ones, created by someone else who had knowledge enough of the art to experiment. Some of them seemed to be quite useless, created for the sake of creation, while others were immensely powerful, and immensely complicated. He had wasted no time at all before he supplied himself with Fuin books of his own, continuing to read hungrily, starting to practice from the very basics of sealing, calligraphy. When he was not training with Kushina he was writing page after page of neat kanji, perfecting the shape of his handwriting as well as the time it took him to complete it. The girl was astonished by his sudden love for the annoying subject, but his efforts piqued her curiosity, and, in the end, he found himself explaining the basic theory to an eager Kushina, who seemed determined to keep up. They started practicing calligraphy together before or after every spar, sometimes attempting to draw simple seals. His living room soon turned into their favorite hangout. Coffee table and floor all covered with stacks upon stacks of papers, all sporting messy writing and makeshift seals, In no time they were both delighting in it, exclaiming happily whenever they found out something new or got the hang of a particularly difficult one. Jiraiya-sensei encouraged his efforts as well, after being very much surprised initially that Minato could actually understand and enjoy learning about seals. His surprise had soon turned into pride as he acknowledged his student's progress, noting that he himself hadn't progressed much in that direction and definitely not at such a young age. What Jiraiya-sensei considered as minimal progress, however, turned out to be far from minimal, as his sensei sat down with him one afternoon and explained to him a few seals that were so complicated that Minato couldn't understand a thing. Jiraiya's pool of knowledge about seals, however, turned out to be nothing compared to what Kushina was receiving from her parents, after having seen her newly developed passion for fuinjutsu. Kushina's father had more than gladly started spending evening after evening with her, explaining the subtleties of the art as no one else, but a Fuin master could, much to Minato's surprise. Kushina excitedly shared everything with him afterwards, not caring if she was supposed to or not. If her parents knew, however, they didn't protest. Minato smiled as he looked at the paper before him, experimenting with one such trick that Kushina had shared with him earlier that evening. If it worked properly, it was supposed to relieve the Fuin user from losing too much chakra with more complicated seals. He felt the familiar excitement that surged through him every time that he experimented with something new, the same determination gripping him as always, not letting go until he mastered it. The will of fire, Sandaime called it, the will to never give up. She heard a tumble of rushing footsteps followed by a loud thump and a yelp of pain, and she sighed. Her daughter was always clumsy when in a rush. Ryumi placed the plate with onigiri on the table just as Kushina burst through the door, massaging her elbow furiously. "Good morning, Mom, Dad," she said quickly, taking a few fast steps to the table and snatching up a few onigiri, stuffing one in her mouth and putting the rest in her pockets. Ryumi sighed as her husband quietly put down his cup of tea and pinned their daughter with a chilly look. "Just where do you think you're going, young lady?" "Sorry, Dad, gotta go, meefing Minafo," she said through a rush, still chewing, bits of food flying out of her mouth. "Kushina Uzumaki, hold it right there," her husband said sharply, and the red-haired girl froze, giving her father an annoyed look. "Dad, I'm late." "Do not talk with your mouth full." Kushina chewed quickly and gulped, fuming quietly. "Now will you explain to me why you are so disrespectful to your mother, who spent the entire morning preparing breakfast, and you won't even sit down and appreciate it?" "Dad, I'm late. I have a meeting with Minato. We got appointed on the same mission today, and we are meeting earlier to prepare together. I don't have time for breakfast." Ryumi smiled affectionately as she saw her daughter waving hands chaotically while trying to argue with her father. They looked very much alike. She had inherited his dark red hair, characteristic for his clan, and she possessed the same sternness in her eyes, the length and easy flow of her hair, however, and the easy carefree smiles were all her. Her husband sighed and closed his eyes in defeat. "You spend an abnormal amount of time with that boy. He's my friend, so what of it?" Kushina snapped, suddenly on the defensive. "What your father meant to say," Ryumi said quickly, moving behind her husband and placing two hands on his shoulders, "is that you and Minato have grown very close, but we still haven't met him personally. We would love to have him over for dinner sometime. Maybe you can invite him after the mission." Kushina's face positively lit up as it stretched into a big grin. "Thank you, Mom. I'm sure he'd love to." She shouted quickly and rushed to her mother, standing on her toes to give her a quick peck on the cheek. Hi, now off you go before you are late." Ryumi chided through a smile. Kushina needn't hear it twice. She waved happily and bolted through the door with another onigiri already in her mouth. Hyojin Uzumaki sighed again and lifted the teacup to his lips. "I am not sure about this, Ryumi," he said heavily after a few minutes of silence during which the woman had started rinsing the dishes behind him. "He is the first friend Kushina has made, dear. She is very close to him. That is what bothers me, they are too close." "Dear," Ryumi said, adopting a scolding voice, "they are children, they are barely 13, you shouldn't be worried about such things." Another heavy sigh reached her ears. "You are right, of course, but it is not the present that worries me," he said sternly, and Ryumi frowned. "Let's think about the future when it arrives at our doorstep. You know as well as I do that friendships like that easily grow into infatuations. Dear, your daughter is still a child. Do not put on that strict father face yet, you are being overprotective for no reason. Besides, what of it? Minato is a sweet boy, the entire village is praising him," Ryumi was saying through exasperation. Her husband was really blowing things out of proportions. Had he forgotten how very young their daughter still was? Ryumi, you know this is not just about me doing my role as a father. As Kushina's guardians, we cannot let Minato Namikaze make such a choice without being fully informed of Kushina's situation, he said, the last word heavy on his tongue. It will only hurt the boy, nor can we inform him as of yet. He is just a child. Precisely, he is just a child. Even if he weren't, it wouldn't be up to us to inform him of anything. It is Kushina's burden and it is her choice to share it. Hyojin. Being a Jinchuriki doesn't mean that Kushina doesn't have feelings or that someone cannot have feelings for her. As her guardians, we will protect her from the dangers that those feelings pose to her and to her close people. But as her parents, we will also support her. For now, cast that thought aside. There is time until the future. Let her enjoy the present. The low grumble from behind her was all the assent she needed before she smiled. He scanned the area again, trying to catch a glimpse of anything out of order. The moon was nearly full, thus making the night a bright one. It would be hard for anyone to sneak up on them. When he didn't see or hear anything out of place, he returned his attention to the delicate slip of paper that he was working on, carefully writing kanji in an intricate web while embedding it with chakra to create a simple seal. He squinted, trying to see a particular corner of the small paper, making sure he didn't omit anything. The scarce light made him move closer to the fire, trying to see better. His eyes involuntarily slipped over the two figures next to it, Tsukumo-sensei leaning on a tree, fast asleep, and Kushina, curled in a ball under her travel cloak, equally subdued. The smile sprung to his lips before he realized it, watching the peaceful expression on her face, and the way her hair was coiled in every direction like a carpet of flames. He looked back at the seal he was forming. The paper had the same gorgeous color, and his smile grew larger. Yes, he had chosen well. A hollow branch, tossed in the fire, popped, sending a loud cracking sound through the still night. The noise made Kushina frown in a half-awakened state, suddenly making her realize that her left side had grown numb from the cold ground. With a stifled yawn she turned around and her eyes fluttered open to scan the meadow just in case. It hadn't been too long since the end of her sentry shift. Minato was still on guard, sitting peacefully by the fire. Her movement had caught his attention, and he was now looking at her through a smile, his hands clutching something small in his lap. She smiled back and closed her eyes in an attempt to dive into her dreams again. But sleep eluded her. An image of Minato, face illuminated by the fire with shadows playing in his hair, came before her eyes and she looked up again, as if to confirm that she hadn't fallen asleep yet. Minato had shifted his attention to the small object in his hands now, scrutinizing it with a frown on his face. This caught her attention. With a yawn she stood up and slowly approached him, sitting next to him in the grass. You should really take some rest, Kushina. You were on guard until now, the boy said slowly. I'm not tired, she murmured and yawned again, to which Minato simply raised an eyebrow. Okay, I am. But I can't fall asleep, you know, she said quietly, eyeing her sensei to see if their voices were bothering him. The man seemed to be genuinely asleep, after having spent the better part of the night on watch. So what are you doing? She asked curiously, peeking over his shoulder to see what he was holding. To her surprise he pulled it aside, a nervous smile appearing on his face. He began, but stopped midway through, eyeing her carefully. The girl's eyebrows mashed in suspicion. What, you know? Are you developing some new technique? She asked pointedly, pulling away with annoyance. To her surprise he laughed softly. I suppose I might as well show you, since it's already the 10th in a way, he said quietly, and she couldn't help but notice the nervous tint to his voice. It piqued on her curiosity even more. Give me your hand. Kushina stared at him with wide eyes, feeling her cheeks warming up. Had she heard right? The fire popped loudly in the sudden silence, snapping her out of her initial surprise. Minato held out his own hand, waiting for her to take it. She hesitated for a second, before doing as he asked, feeling goosebumps running down her arm at the warm touch. He smiled before gently turning her hand palm upwards and moving his other hand over it. Happy birthday, Kushina, he whispered, moving his hands away, leaving her to stare at the little slip of red paper he had placed in her palm. Thanks? Was all she managed, lifting a questioning look at his face. He chuckled and lifted a hand before his face, making a quick seal. The slip of paper in her hands suddenly came to life, folding on itself many times, as if guided by invisible hands. Kushina stared in astonishment as it slowly started resembling a flower, a perfect imitation of a flower, insomuch that it no longer looked like paper as much as it looked like a real blossom. A beautiful red cherry blossom lay in her palm, pulsating gently with a subtle surge of chakra. As soon as it stopped folding, taking its final shape, the air filled with the scent of it. Could paper have a scent? This one definitely did, reminding her of spring afternoons spent in Field 3 below the cherry trees, laughing as a cascade of such blossoms, only white, fell all over her. The girl couldn't help but stare at it, her mouth forming a silent O, overwhelmed by the sudden surge of emotion. He had remembered her birthday. He had given her a gift. No, the most wonderful gift. It was simple, and that's what made it so beautiful. No one had ever given her any gifts, her parents excluded, so she found herself at a loss for words. For once she didn't know how to react. Her eyes slowly lifted to meet his warm blue ones and she blinked, seeing hesitation. The boy picked the origami from her hands with exaggerated slowness, as if expecting her to jump away from him, and then leaned forward. Kushina froze, cheeks burning, her heartbeat drumming in her ears. Minato didn't notice, or if he did, he pretended not to, as his hand gently tucked her hair behind one ear, placing the cherry blossom behind it, and fastening it with her hair clip. He quickly withdrew after that, nodding once to himself, the same warm smile on his face as before, cheeks reddened to match her own. Then now, he whispered gently, it has the same beautiful color as your hair and the same beautiful scent. I've embedded my own chakra in it, so it will never wither as long as I live. It's my promise, he said, and met her eyes with a stern look, that I will never leave. Minato, she began, but choked on her own voice as she felt her eyes water. I know, he said through a content smile, saving her the effort to remember how words work. The boy quietly turned to look at the fire again, his merry smile never leaving his face. As he leaned peacefully on the fat tree he was sitting next to, Kushina imitated him, gazing at the dancing flames. Gratitude, trust, companionship and admiration were burning her on the inside, and she found herself at a loss about how to voice them. Surrendering to her lack of eloquence, she leaned on Minato to the side, lowering her head on his shoulder and finding his hand with her own, giving it a quick, gentle squeeze. Thank you. I'm sure it went this way, she said sourly, scanning the meadow below them. Minato chuckled. Her annoyed, pouty face was always an amusing sight. Stop laughing, you know. It's a shared mission. Help me find the goddamn beast, the girl exclaimed, waving a fist from ahead of him. They were both perched on two separate branches of a tall tree, using the advantage of height in their attempts to locate their client's pet. It was a C-rank mission at best, and that mostly because of the ridiculous amount of payment the client had promised to anyone who managed to deal with what he described to be a sweet, but willful beast. He sighed, thinking of the absurdity of the situation. They wouldn't have been assigned with something so bothersome if Kushina hadn't called the Hokage geezer before his entire office when they were reporting back from their single shared mission. While the Hokage had laughed off the disrespectful name, he had also decided to show a sense of humor in his own way, by making them take care of a mission that any newly found genin could carry out. It's not my fault, you know, she snapped, as if having read his thoughts. He is old. That doesn't mean you need to tell it to him. So what? He is the Hokage. He should be able to deal with the truth, you know. When I am Hokage, I'll let people call me however they want to, she said with finality. Fair enough, but until then you better address me respectfully or I'll make you chase cats even as a jonin, Minato teased through a grin. You'll never make Hokage before me, you know, she snapped and threw him an angry look. He shook his head and laughed. The only title you deserve anyway would be Mina-chan, she continued, and finally, to her immense pleasure, he scowled. You'll never drop it, will you? Never, she said through a wide grin. Since you'd allow people to call you anything, how does Yondaime Hokage Tomato sound to you? He teased back, and Kushina gasped. He had never called her like that. She knew that he was not putting the same scorn behind the name as all the other children at the academy had. She knew he was only using it to vex her in return. But it had worked, and vexed she was. You did not, she said, turning to face him from the branch on which she was standing, parallel to his. He only grinned. With a growl, Kushina launched herself forward, jumping from her branch head first with her arms outstretched, planning to crash into Minato and push him off the tree. He seemed to be expecting it, however, for as soon as she was in the air he dropped his legs down, sitting on the branch, and leaned back parallel to the ground below. Kushina shot right over him. her eyes locking with his for a split of a second as she sailed over him, and her flight took on a vertical trajectory, with her headed face first towards the ground. 2 hands wrapped around her wrists out of nowhere and held her back, her body continuing the momentum and ending up with her doing an involuntary half-somersault in the air, changing her fall to one of feet first with her back to the tree. Kushina never fell, however. She found her feet to have ended up a good few meters from the ground as she still hung in the air. She looked up quickly, meeting Minato's laughing face right above her own. He was hanging head down from the tree with his legs firmly wrapped around the branch, holding her wrists tightly. His golden locks were in disarray, pulled down messily by gravity, giving him an odd, but pleasant look. As pissed as she was, Kushina couldn't help but laugh as well at the absurdity of the situation. "You could have let me fall, you know," the girl said through a grin. "You know I'm agile enough." Minato shook his head with an amused smile on his lips. "I'd never let you fall." Minato, he heard her call his name again and smiled, not opening his eyes, lying on his back calmly in the grass. Soon enough he felt her hair tickle his face as she came to stand over him and leaned down to inspect if he was sleeping. He chuckled and his eyes flashed open, light blue meeting dark purple. His smile widened, finding his face surrounded by blazing red. Inhaling the soft cherry scent about, he blew a fiery bang away from his cheek where it kept tickling him and lifted his hand absent-mindedly, gently running his fingers through her locks. She blushed and smiled back. "I knew you were not asleep, you know," she said merrily, pulling away and sitting down next to him, handing him the one end of a 2-stick ice cream. Minato raised an eyebrow. "I thought we should celebrate," she said excitedly, waving the ice cream around. He smiled back a brilliant smile as he pushed himself up in a sitting position and grabbed the stick, breaking the ice cream into 2 with a quiet pop. "Congratulations," she announced through a grin. "You must be the youngest Chunin in the history of Konoha. You know, Sandaime was 13 when he became a Chunin. So are you." "I'm almost 14, he corrected through a soft smile, acknowledging the compliment nevertheless. "But you are still 13 now, you know," she said through a half-annoyed expression, rolling her eyes as if he was a slow student unable to comprehend an easy theory. "In any case, you were the only one from our age group that passed. That was quite impressive. There weren't that many people from our year in general. I suppose 14 - he stopped as she threw him a measuring look. "I mean 13 is probably too young of an age, but Jiraiya-sensei insisted that I can do it. He knows your abilities better than you do, it would seem," she said in a scolding manner, and he had to laugh at the absurdity of it. Since when was she scolding him for lack of confidence? Kushina smiled at him again before biting into her ice cream in content. He heard footsteps approaching the door and subconsciously straightened his back as a fit of nervousness came over him. He had never before come to Kushina's house uninvited, and he felt terribly wrong for it, as if encroaching on her personal space. His friend had been gone for over 2 days now, however, and with Sakumo-sensei out of the village as well. He had no other way to know where Kushina had disappeared to and if she was alright. As worry started to gnaw on him, he had decided to look for her at the only place it made sense for her to be, at home. The door opened and Minato found himself looking at the soft smiling face of Kushina's mother. Ryumi Uzumaki had the same long silky hair like Kushina, only it was a not so vibrant light brown color. Her eyes, however, were the same as Kushina's both in color and in brightness. He smiled back and bowed his head in respect for the older woman. "Minato-kun, what a pleasant surprise!" she exclaimed through a merry voice. The tightly wound worry in his chest lessened. Surely Kushina's mother wouldn't be so carefree if her daughter was ill. "Ryumi-sama, I apologize for the unexpected visit," he began quietly, feeling at once how very ridiculous it had been to worry for his friend. Kushina did have an amazing recovery rate. There was no way she could be sick. Maybe she just needed a break from all the training. Maybe she got bored of him. He shouldn't have come. "Don't apologize for such things, Minato-kun. It's a pleasure to see you. You know you are always welcome at our home," she said softly, and he looked up in gratitude. "Is it Kushina that you're looking for?" A nod. "I hadn't heard a word from her for the past few days. You got worried?" "Naturally." Her eyes held a mellow look. "Come in. She would be happy to see you." Minato nodded in gratitude and stepped inside, taking his sandals off and continuing to pad barefooted after the kind woman, who was leading him deeper into the house. "That girl, I swear, she loses track of time constantly. I am sure she didn't even think you would be worried. She should have let you know that she's busy," Ryumi muttered under her nose as she stopped before a door, sliding it open and stepping aside to let Minato enter. The first thing he registered was Kushina, kneeling on the floor by her bed. She looked at him in surprise before smiling warmly and greeting him with a loud "OS" through a large grin. He was just about to answer when shrill laughter reached him from behind her, a small hand reaching out and latching onto one of her locks, pulling back victoriously as if having accomplished a long-attempted task. Kushina yelped, hands flying to hold onto her hair as she tumbled back beside a gleeful silver-haired toddler, small hands still gripping her hair in a vice-like hold. Laughter bubbled up the girl's throat as she stretched a hand out, tickling the little boy, and he squealed, quickly releasing his grip. "You cheeky monkey, taking advantage of my distraction," she said, and the child giggled, pushing up to its feet and waddling across the room. He couldn't have been more than a year old, Minato thought. As he followed the kid with a look, he hid behind a chair very determinedly, thinking himself unnoticeable, and Kushina got up to her feet, feigning confusion. "Where, oh where could he be?" she said through a sing-song voice, and Minato chuckled, stepping forward as if dazed. He had never seen his friend around kids, a whole new side of her springing before her eyes. His laughter made the toddler notice him finally, and he could feel the small gray eyes fix on him curiously. He smiled, waving a hand uncertainly, but the boy hedged back, face scrunching up in distress. "Oh, there, Kakashi-chan, Minato is a friend, Nebraska?" Kushina said, rushing forward and sweeping the child up in her arms. "Kakashi-chan? Then he must be. I missed our training, didn't I?" she said as she finally turned back to him, rocking the boy against her hip. He smiled back. "A spar or two, don't worry about it. But it's so nice you're here now, I can officially introduce you, you know," she said happily and approached, turning slightly so Kakashi could peer tentatively at him. "So, Minato Namikaze, this is Kakashi Hatake, he's Sensei's son. Sensei had to go on a mission for a few days and the lady that usually watches him is sick, so we volunteered to take care of him in the meantime since," she said quietly, "you know, he doesn't have a mom." Minato nodded quietly before directing his attention to the boy just as he heard the door behind him slide shut, Ryumi Uzumaki having left them with the kid. "Hello, Kakashi-chan," he said softly, and, to his horror, Kakashi made a choke sound and turned his head around, burying his face in Kushina's hair. "Oh, don't be grumpy now. He gets like this when he's hungry. Don't worry about it. It's not personal, you know." Minato still took a step back, just in case. He had never handled such young kids before, at least not out of missions, and he had no idea what he had done wrong. The child had started squirming now, little feet waving against her side, and Kushina sighed, gently letting the boy down and following him with a look as he made his way to a pack of stuffed kunai to the side. He plopped on the ground, small hands wrapping about his toys. "He's a bundle of energy and pouts right now, but he's honestly a joy to have around, you know. Wanna stay some, exhaust him proper? He likes playing tag in the garden, don't let him fool ya, he can be crazy fast. I don't think he likes me much." "Nonsense, he'll love you, you'll see, you're pretty hard not to like." His eyes widened, color rising to his cheeks, a feeling of warmth shooting down his frame as he directed a startled look at her. Kushina took a moment to realize what she had just said, and then her mouth clamped shut, face turning a similar shade to her hair. I meant," she gulped. You're sociable, you know." Before he could say anything else, Kakashi had made his way back to them, bringing a handful of toys with him and dumping them at Minato's feet. "Play," he said, and the blonde near jumped. I guess I will stay a while, if that's all right." "Sure, not that I care, you know, it's fine." He nodded, cheeks still burning, an inexplicable feeling of heat melting in his chest as he knelt beside Kakashi, ruffling his hair with one hand. "So this is it, huh?" Mikoto said quietly and leaned back at the tree she was sitting next to. Minato and Kushina both turned to look at her from where they were lying in the grass, still breathing heavily after their last spar. "Our last peaceful afternoon," the black-haired girl continued with downcast eyes, as her hands plucked a dandelion absent-mindedly, and she held it before her face, twisting it around. The other two remained quiet for a while, the silence broken only by the cry of the cicadas. It was a hot summer's day, ideal for time spent by the stream. "Don't think of it like that, Mikoto-san," Minato said finally, voice heavier than usual. "How am I supposed to think of it then? We're all getting deployed tomorrow. From now on this," she said and waved a hand in the general direction of the meadow, "will be rare, a treasured memory. We'll spend our afternoons in battles at the front, in trenches. The wind picked up, making the dandelion disperse and sending its seeds flying around them. This war will be over in no time, and then everything will go back to how it was, you know, Kushina said merrily, rising into a sitting position as well. We'll protect our village and our people, and we will be heroes, you know, she said through a cheeky grin. Mikoto smiled softly. Heroes are the ones who die for peace, she said through a barely audible whisper, and her eyes directed towards the memorial stone at the edge of Training Field 3, hidden by foliage. Her words hung in the air, as if a shadow had suddenly dimmed the bright sunny day. They had all feared it, even Kushina, who was masking her worries with an enthusiastic smiling face. But Mikoto was the only one to voice it. Sometimes I wish I hadn't made Chunin. My mother kept telling me that 14 is too young, but I wanted to prove myself, Mikoto continued in the ghastly silence. If we were still genins we wouldn't be sent to the warfield. Don't get me wrong, she added hastily, seeing Kushina's skeptical look. I want to protect my village and my friends, but I am not sure I am ready for the horrors of war, to kill scores of people for someone else's ideals. I just want to live like this. Like now. I don't want to face tomorrow. I want to stay here, by the river, in the field with the dandelions. Minato sat up with a sigh. If we do not protect our village, all of this will be gone. There will be no field with dandelions when we come back. We have to fight for what we cherish. We're not children anymore. We can only do our best so that the generations that come after us will know the peace we knew until now, just as our predecessors fought to give us that same peace, he said quietly and turned to look at his two friends with a smile. Besides, we have each other. Nothing will happen to us. One day, when this war is over, we'll come back here and lie down with the dandelions again. Promise? Mikoto's voice was shaky, but held more force than before. I do, Minato vowed and stretched a hand out in the air. On! Let's show them the fire will of Konoha, you know! Kushina exclaimed, putting her hand over Minato's. Mikoto nodded, adding her hand to theirs with a smile. Minato felt the hand squeeze his shoulder lightly as he was crouching below the gray memorial stone. He kept his face down, eyes closed, not wanting to face whoever it was giving him consolation. His mind was painting pictures before his eyes, pictures of the carefree, laugh-filled days that his team had spent in times of peace. Tora had been laughing then, he had always laughed, shouting the loudest, charging first. He had been a pain in the ass more often than not, but he had also been fun. He had been a friend. He had been someone whom Minato always admired for his strong will and resolve. Minato had always been a few steps ahead of him, excelling in most everything effortlessly, but Tora never gave up chasing after him. Minato opened his eyes and raised his head to look at the new names engraved in the stone just recently. I am Shino, Onairi Tosaku, Tora Otakebe. He gulped, his fingers tracing his friend's name quietly. The person standing behind him shifted and Minato finally looked back to see Mikoto, standing behind him with her head bowed down. There was a bouquet of white flowers in her one hand, contrasting sharply with her plain black clothes. Very much like his own, she had come to mourn too. Her other hand was still on his shoulder, shuddering lightly with the girl's quiet sobs. Wordlessly, Minato stood up and walked away, giving her a moment of privacy. He had seen the admiration with which Mikoto had looked at Tora and he had come to acknowledge her feelings. Feelings that could never be, he knew full well, because Mikoto had been promised to someone from her own clan upon her birth. That had not stopped her from cherishing Tora, however, and he knew that if there was someone from Team 7 who truly suffered right now it was Mikoto. He hung his head quietly, cursing this war. He knocked on the Hokage's office room and waited patiently for his sensei's response. With permission granted, he entered quietly to find Hiruzen Sarutobi standing by the window with his back to him, gazing over the rooftops of Konoha. It was midday and the autumn sun was burning mercilessly, creating a haze over the heated tiles. A trickle of smoke was escaping the Hokage's lips as he sucked on his favorite thin pipe. You called for me, Hiruzen-sensei, Jiraiya said lightly, allowing himself the lower title of sensei when there was no one around. To him Hiruzen Sarutobi would always be the teacher before the Hokage. The older man turned with a heavy look and nodded, going to sit behind his desk. I'm sorry for your loss, Jiraiya. Tora Otakebe was a talented shinobi. He died with honor, Sandaime said quietly, and Jiraiya's throat clenched. He nodded in acknowledgement. In fact, his student's death was resulting badly on him. It hadn't been his fault. They had been appointed to completely different divisions. But Jiraiya still felt like he had let him down. like he hadn't managed to teach him well enough for the boy to survive. Again, an image of 3 smiling kids flashed before his eyes: Yahiko, Nagato, Kanan. Gone. He quickly cast the thought aside, burying it deep down. You did all you could, Jiraiya, for the brief period that you taught him. For 3 years is brief indeed. You were as good a teacher as I ever was. This war was untimely. If the boy was given the chance to train under you further, he would have grown to be a strong shinobi, perhaps surpassing his predecessors as well. Hokage-sama. The sudden official title made Hiruzen look at him through a serious face as well. I believe you didn't call for me to give me condolences. Sandaime sighed and slowly placed his pipe down. Indeed I did not, he said finally in his diplomatic voice. I called you here because I have need of your extraordinary talents, legendary Sannin Jiraiya. As you may know, when it comes to open front wars such as the one we are having now, the intel units are as important as the fighting divisions. With the sharpening of the tensions between the nations, however, our network of informants seems to be faltering. Many capable shinobi do not succeed with their infiltration missions. Or if they do, they stop transmitting information shortly after. One disturbing piece of intel that we managed to receive before our informant was taken down came from Kumogakure. Apparently the Reikage has finally found a compatible host for the Hachibi, but his intentions in the war are still unclear. Unfortunately, our knowledge in the matter stops there. Our biggest problem right now, however, is Iwagakure, who, as you know, we would be facing on the field if the current peace treaty doesn't hold. Their security is heightened and infiltration is nigh impossible. We managed to receive some information about a possible arming of squads around the neutral zones, but things were unclear as our informant was soon rooted out. Sunagakure is also stirring, with prospects of entering the war should it resume, unknown on whose side. With so many variables and unknowns, even my brightest battle strategists are feeling as if asked to gamble rather than devise a plan. We are at a stalemate, and I believe that the current peace is taken as an opportunity to restock both sides before continuing. Sarutobi paused for a moment, giving Jiraiya a long testing look. You have, so far, proven yourself to be the best shinobi infiltrator that Konoha has. As powerful a warrior as you are, and as useful an asset as you may be on the field, it is crucial that we set up a new reliable network of intel, and I believe that you are most suited for the job. If things don't change, I believe we might be facing a third shinobi world war in the future. The white-haired man nodded. He had expected something of the sort. Jiraiya of the legendary Sannin, I appoint you with the S-rank mission to infiltrate the nations of the lighting, earth and wind, and provide us with intel about the enemy's strategies, plans and any other information relevant to the war for as long as it continues. I hereby disband Team 7 from its active duties until the time of your return. Your students will be assigned under a new Jonin leader. Will you accept this mission? Jiraiya grinned. Who else but me? He said cheekily, and the Hokage smiled through a nod. Very well, you are to prepare accordingly in the following day and leave first thing in the morning the day after. Hiruzen sighed and fixed him with a soft look. We are counting on you, Jiraiya. The whole village is counting on you. Good luck. Jiraiya nodded somberly. Dismissed. But the white-haired man stayed rooted to the spot. Sandaime lifted an eyebrow. Is there something unclear about the mission I assigned you? No, Hokage-sama. Everything is clear, he said, and remained silent for a few seconds before continuing. I request your permission to take on an apprentice. Silence hung in the room. Minato Namikaze? Sandaime said heavily, and Jiraiya nodded again. He is my brightest and most promising student. I wish to train him further over the course of the next few years while carrying out my mission. Our peace treaty is fragile, Jiraiya. If the fighting resumes, we will need every shinobi in this war, Sandaime said quietly, his voice trailing off with uncertainty. Jiraiya scowled. The boy will be an even greater asset if he is allowed to grow into the powerful shinobi he can be. Allow me to nurture him, Hiruzen-sensei. Allow me to train him and guide him, and if this war is not over by the time I'm back, he will be the one to end it. I believe in him. I believe he might be the child of prophecy. The room fell silent once more as Sandaime picked up his pipe and took a few draws, not taking his eyes off Jiraiya. Very well, he said finally in a tired voice. I shall believe in your judgment as well. With the boy's assent, I assign Minato Namikaze as your apprentice. He is to leave with you the day after tomorrow. Jiraiya grinned in gratitude and bowed his head. Thank you, Hiruzen-sensei. The Hokage smiled warmly. Watch over him, Jiraiya. If you are right, he might well be the savior of this world. The sun was setting slowly, bathing the whole village in a golden color. Minato could see its rays reflected in the windows of the houses, making them look as if aflame. The Hokage monument offered a grand view of the entire village, but although it was beautiful, it did not stir him. His thoughts were far away, still focused on the teammate he had lost. A small tack from behind him announced someone's arrival, and Minato already knew who it was without looking, recognizing instantly his sensei's familiar chakra signature. The white-haired man sat next to him wordlessly and directed a stern look at the horizon. They had both arrived back for Tora's funeral, for which Minato was grateful. His sensei's presence was strangely comforting, even in silence, as it happened now. After what felt as an immeasurable amount of time, his sensei sighed and turned to look at him, the same serious look never leaving his face. As of today our team has been disbanded, Jiraiya started carefully, and Minato felt his throat tighten. I have been assigned a new mission, a prolonged one. I am leaving the day after tomorrow and probably will not return for the next few years. Minato blinked, his mind refusing to wrap itself around the information presented. He had just lost his teammate, his friend, and now his sensei was leaving too? His sensei, who had been like a father to him through all those years, was leaving now. He tried to hide the sting of pain that the news brought him, averting his eyes to look at his hands instead and managing a stiff nod. His sensei reached out and placed a large hand on his shoulder. Minato, do you want to come with me? His eyes widened. It will be a few years away from home, but it will be a few years during which you will have my full, undivided attention. I will train you in every shinobi art known to me and share my knowledge best as I could. Minato stared in disbelief. On the one hand he had Konoha and Kushina, all the people that he wanted to protect in the war, and now he had to leave, not knowing how they can fare without him. He had made a promise with Kushina and Mikoto that they would fight this war together. Training now seemed like abandoning this promise and running away. On the other hand, he had his sensei, his mentor, the legendary Sannin Jiraiya, who he had come to love as a father, offering him the honor of an apprenticeship that some could only dream of. He bit his lip. He had promised to Kushina that he would never leave. But he wasn't truly leaving, was he? He would be back in just a few years, stronger than before and able to protect her and the entire village. Protect them as he could not protect Tora now. He would still be helping them in the war. It was a mission that he was setting out with after all, along with his sensei. Jiraiya must have seen the change, for he grinned and tossed his question once again. So, Minato Namikaze, do you accept being my apprentice? It would be my honor, Jiraiya-sensei, he said with a slight bow of his head, and Jiraiya laughed loudly. Damn right it would be. Hokage-sama already assigned you as such. The question was only a formality, he said through a grin, ruffling the boy's hair. Minato smiled, feeling the sting of sadness along with his elation. How on earth was he going to tell Kushina? Kushina, Minato is here, came her mother's voice from the front of the house, and the girl stopped arranging her backpack and quickly stood up. She was supposed to head out of the village again, having been allowed a few days back in Konoha to attend the funerals of a few fellow shinobi in her year. Tora Otakebe, Minato's teammate, had been one of them. She had met with her friend briefly upon her arrival, and they hadn't had the chance to talk much, but that short moment was enough for her to see how much the loss had affected him. Minato's usual warm smile now had a sad tint to it, and his eyes held the pain of war. She had expected him to need time to mourn for his friend, therefore. Her mother's announcement made her start before she headed towards the door in quick steps. Sure enough, Minato was waiting for her, his back now turned to the door, his hands tucked leisurely in his pockets. Minato, she breathed, and an involuntary smile lit her face, only to be extinguished as he turned to face her, and she saw his conflicted expression. His eyes tightened as he saw her, and whatever it was that he was about to say froze in his throat before he had opened his mouth. "What's wrong?" she said quietly, deciding that this pain was something new, unrelated to Tora. The blond boy sighed and ran a shaky hand through his hair. "Walk with me," he said through a deceptively calm voice, and she could only nod before putting on her sandals and following him down the lane. He stayed quiet for a while, walking aimlessly as if deep in thought. Kushina decided, against all the curiosity and worry welling up, to remain quiet and give him time to think. Finally, when crossing one of the many red wooden bridges over the Konoha River, Minato stopped and leaned over the railings. Kushina did likewise, stealing a side glance at him. Finally, when the silence seemed to stretch unbearably long, Minato sighed. "Kushina, he began, but choked on the words. "What is it, Minato?" Just spit it out already, you know. The boy straightened his back. Jiraiya-sensei was assigned an extended mission outside the border of the Land of Fire. He is leaving tomorrow and he has offered me to join him as his apprentice for the next 4 years, he said slowly and turned to face her with a stern look. I accepted. A gust of wind swirled the branches around them, making the old wooden bridge creak. Kushina stared, numb to everything around her. She opened and closed her mouth a few times, unable to find the proper words. You said you wouldn't leave, she said finally in a hollow voice. I won't, I am not leaving, Kushina. I will be away for a while. But I will be back before you know it, and I will be stronger than before. And he paused, his hands clenching in fists. I will be able to protect those who matter to me. I will protect everyone. Kushina nodded and wordlessly turned to go, leaving a dumbstruck Minato alone on the bridge. The morning was a pleasant one, the sun barely having made it above the horizon. The northwest gate of the village walls was empty, save for the small party that had gathered there to send Minato and Jiraiya off. Tsunade had appeared, bringing 2 fully equipped medical kits for both of them, accompanied by Tsukumo-sensei, who wanted to wish them luck and safe travels. Mikoto had also arrived after a few minutes, replacing the tear-stricken face from yesterday with an encouraging smile, telling Minato how much stronger he will grow by the time they meet again. Minato smiled in gratitude and nodded absent-mindedly. She hadn't come, she wouldn't come, he had known it since yesterday, but he realized now with a pang of pain that he had still hoped. Mikoto noticed his down spirits, but didn't ask further. Having guessed the source of his unease, after a few more minutes of brief discussions between Jiraiya and Tsukumo, Jiraiya sighed, inspected the streets with a quick look, and armed his backpack. Come on, kid, let's head out, morning's not getting any brighter. Minato nodded and picked up his own heavy backpack. Thank you for coming, Mikoto, take care, okay? The black-haired girl, however, didn't look at him, focusing on something behind him instead and smiling. He quickly turned, his eyes immediately locking on the small running figure, fiery hair dancing behind her with each step. Minato couldn't stop the smile from spilling on his face as he stepped forward to meet her. Kushina stopped a few feet before him and doubled over, hands on her knees, trying to catch her breath. You came, he said lamely, not knowing how else to start the conversation after their awkward parting yesterday. Of course I did, dummy, she said through heavy breaths and straightened her back, giving him a cheeky smile. Thank you, he murmured, trying to embed in the words how very much this meant to him. Don't thank me, you know, I came only to tell you that if you go back on your words I'll kill you, so you better stay alive, you know. We have a challenge, so don't you dare back out. I'll be fighting you over the title for Hokage one day, you know, she exclaimed and put her hands on her hips. Despite everything, Minato found himself laughing. You know I won't step down that easily, he said finally through a grin, and Kushina's expression softened. Here, she said, taking something out of her pocket and handing it to him. He took it curiously, glancing down at what appeared to be a yellow slip of paper. His lips spread in a smile even before Kushina waved a seal before her, and the paper started folding in a familiar way. Soon, in his hand stood a perfect lifelike miniature of a bright sun, similar to his own gift. The origami pulsated with Kushina's embedded chakra, almost radiating warmth. His smile grew larger, throat clamping up as he held onto the little sun, her gift meaning more to him than anything he had ever been given. There, see, it has the same color as your hair too, she teased, and he chuckled, before she added through blazing cheeks, and it's also warm, like your smile. It will be warm as long as I'm fine, you know, so that you can know I'm safe too. It's my promise, that I will wait for you. Minato couldn't believe his ears, a sudden warm feeling spreading within him, a feeling that he hadn't felt before, or if he hadn't truly acknowledged. His new revelation left him tongue-tied, but Kushina didn't let it register. So you better come back faster, you know, she finished, and as usual, aimed a light punch at his shoulder. The blonde boy was just about to chuckle and thank her when she did the most unexpected thing. She stepped closer and quickly pecked his cheek, before once again turning around wordlessly and running off. Minato stared after her, frozen in place, his cheeks burning and his whole face once again as red as that damned girl's hair. The Hokage scowled, eyebrows mashing together in distaste, as he inspected another report, this one from the medical unit of Division 5 on the border with Suna. Amongst the many losses that had reduced the efficiency of their team over the last year, there were new problems added. The medics were running out of supplies, and with Suna's altered invasion plans, supplying any of the units of Divisions 5 and 2 had grown increasingly difficult. He had to admit the Hokage had stepped things up. The man was causing serious problems ever since Sunagakure joined the war, renewing the hostilities short of a year ago. Now their attacks, mostly of sabotage nature, were leaving his forces crippled. His ninja were invading rather than attacking head-on, assassinating the much-needed medics and cutting off their supply lines. Hiruzen sighed in annoyance and tossed the paper aside. He already knew the information. He had read it twice. His fingers kept drumming on his desk absent-mindedly as he picked up another report from Division 3, recently relocated to the border with IWA. His eyes were skipping over the contents, and he realized soon that he wasn't getting anything of what was written. His mind was still coiling around the situation with Suna, worry gnawing on him like a worm might an apple. He had sent what he deemed to be the most appropriate teams for the job, being given the task to counter the Kazakage's shrewd plans. But he still felt like he wasn't doing enough, he wasn't helping enough, he couldn't be everywhere. Despite the brief period of strained peace, the last 3 years hadn't felt calm at all. None of the great nations had made any steps towards demilitarizing their units, nor had they retreated from the front lines fully. Everyone had been prepared to launch back into militant activities as soon as a good enough cause presented itself. Sunagakure announcing war on Konoha had been an excellent such occasion for a Wagakure to rejoin the fight as well. For almost a year now they had been forced to lead a war on 2 fronts too long, he thought. His people were exhausted and hungry for peace, which didn't seem possible in the near future. The casualties were growing, as were the defeats, and Konohagakure soon found itself pressed for men and funds. The Land of Fire was losing territories at the IWA border, being forced on the defense for the past few weeks, and now things had started to deteriorate with Suna as well. The man closed his eyes and lifted a hand to massage his temples, feeling the oncoming headache. All in all, things were not going well for Konoha, and it felt like he, the Hokage who was supposed to protect everyone, was not helping enough. Part of the nagging feeling came from the fact that he couldn't leave, being the village's protector entitled residing within the village at all times, regardless of the situation on the borders, dealing with paperwork instead of actual enemies and anticipating a direct attack on the village that could never come. All this paperwork is making you lose it, Hiruzen-sensei. Sandaime smiled. Jiraiya, he said, and the relief was evident in his voice as he turned to the windows behind him to find the white-haired man sitting leisurely in the windowsill. We hadn't expected you back so soon. The Sannin grinned. A hero always arrives unexpected. Hiruzen found himself chuckling despite the serious situation at hand. I've been keeping tabs on some of the reports in and out of the villages where I could, Konoha included. Looks like this war isn't going too well, Jiraiya said in a somewhat somber voice. The Hokage slowly took out his pipe from a drawer and lit it wordlessly, getting up from his chair to stand next to his student and look over the rooftops of Konoha. His one hand, out of habit, clenched a light fist behind his back, while the other raised the pipe to his mouth for a draw. I'm afraid so, he said slowly, suddenly aware of how old and tired his voice sounded, like that of a man who had lived through it all. We lost many good shinobi and still there's little prospect of change. Or if there is, it's most unfavorable, he murmured, smoke trickling past his lips. There is still time to change things for the better, now that the strongest and brightest shinobi in Konoha has returned, Jiraiya said, a grin on his lips once again. Hiruzen had to suppress the urge to chuckle again. His student certainly had some eloquence to describe himself. Jiraiya, you know the intel that you have been providing us with has saved many lives and secured many victories. I still need you out there, now more than ever. Jiraiya would indeed be a formidable addition to the front, but his skills were more needed elsewhere. Actually, sensei, Jiraiya said, and mischief twinkled in his eyes this time, I wasn't talking about myself at all. Minato sighed, realizing where his feet had taken him unintentionally. He had spent the largest part of an hour wandering aimlessly around the village, enjoying being back for the first time in what appeared to be a little over 3 years. Despite having been an interesting journey, it had felt like ages spent away from his dearest place, and somehow the feeling of longing for his village had never dulled. He glanced around absent-mindedly, taking a mental note of all he saw, observation skills kicking in by habit. Things hadn't changed much. Buildings were mostly the same, slightly altered here and there, renovated or retouched. Some new shops had sprung up across the main street, newer stalls replacing old ones, temporary markets opening at corners to accommodate the wares of refugees. Difference marked the eyes of people, however. hiding in stooped postures and hollow faces, and in hurried steps, he had to repress a sigh, despite being away from the gruesome warfronts. The dire situation was taxing for everyone, even for the civilians who lived in relatively peaceful areas. The war spared no one the pain. The absence of familiar faces only fed into the creeping feeling of alienation. He had assumed that most of his friends and teammates had been sent to different warfronts to defend the country of fire, and so far he seemed to have been correct. He made his way down a familiar path, straying away from the bustling streets, and nearing the greener outer regions of Konoha. The song of the cicadas was high and shrill here, complementing the rustle of the trees all about. Leaves danced merrily with the warm summer breeze, whispering the melody that gave Konoha its name, the village hidden in the leaves. How much he missed that, too. His legs had carried him towards the training fields without thinking. Having picked the route out of habit after many afternoons spent there with Kushina, he sighed and ran a hand carelessly through his hair, thoughts wandering to his friend, a bout of nervousness overcoming him at once. Would she be happy to see him again? Or would she have forgotten all about him, outgrowing the childish affection she had felt for a friend who had promised he'd never leave and had still done just that? Would it be rude to drop in unannounced after all this time, or should he wait for her to hear he was back? And would she even be in Konoha now, with this war going on? He didn't realize when he had reached their favorite training field, still mulling over fervent thoughts, when his attention was pinned by a frazzled chakra signature up ahead and he paused in surprise. A small figure was moving in between the wooden posts, throwing shuriken and kunai at targets with surprising accuracy. Minato could only stare. The kid, for a kid it surely was, had developed impressive accuracy for such a tender age. He couldn't have been older than 5, if that hadn't shocked him enough. He was downright flabbergasted when the child ran up the one wooden post, gathering chakra at his feet, and using his momentum to aim more kunai at the post to his right. Using chakra manipulation at this age? Just who was this kid? "You'll swallow a cicada if you keep that up, boy," said an amused voice from beside him, and Minato turned around with a start, having been too fixated on the boy to notice the approaching chakra signature. "Sakumo-sensei," Minato acknowledged with a smile, "I hadn't expected to see you here. As glad as I am to see you again after all those years, I have to return the remark, Minato-kun. We hadn't expected your return until after the year's end. Is Jiraiya with you? Has something happened?" Minato shook his head with a reassuring smile. "No emergencies. Jiraiya-sensei decided to visit Konoha earlier though. We've been hearing about the course that the war is taking," the blond man said cautiously. The white-haired man sighed, adopting a serious look. Yes, any help is welcome in times like these. I shouldn't be too surprised. The situation has been rapidly deteriorating in the past few months, and we do seem to always need more men. It's a rare sight to see a capable shinobi in the village proper these days." Minato raised an eyebrow pointedly at him and Sakumo had to chuckle. "Hey now, don't give me that look. I'm simply visiting. Gotta keep an eye on my son every now and then, don't I?" the white-haired man said through a grin, gesturing towards the still training boy, obviously enjoying the startled look of recognition that entered Minato's eyes. He turned to the child again, noting the familiar silver hair. "Kakashi? He's grown," Sakumo laughed. "Like a weed, feels like only yesterday he was waddling around." Minato nodded, his eyes following the silver-haired boy as he aimed a blunt kunai at a distant target, hitting a near bull's-eye without breaking a sweat. "He's come a long way from waddling though, it would seem," the blonde said with a smile. "To be able to manipulate chakra at such an early age, he's incredibly skillful. Have you been training him personally?" Sakumo sighed and turned to the boy as well, Look following him fondly across the meadow. "Whenever I can't be here for him always, but I dare say the boy was born talented and with wits on top of it all. He progresses well on his own, as far as basic techniques go. In fact, I believe he will be able to graduate the academy by the end of the year." "At such a young age?" Minato couldn't keep the surprise out of his voice. It was unusual for a child to be enrolled so early in the academy at all, not to mention graduating. Kakashi was undoubtedly a prodigy, but entering the shinobi system at such an early age. "Well, you've been away from the village so you wouldn't know, but the academy graduation age dropped considerably due to the war and now stands at an average of 9 years. Kakashi is advanced in his preparation, but even so he will graduate with only 3 years of a head start. It won't be a bad thing, seeing as he has already mastered most of the basics taught by the academy, and since I can't be here always to guide him further." The only logical solution would be to find a sensei for him until he is of age to join a team. Minato nodded slowly. He had already known about the dropped graduation age. It was a standard procedure during war, the same having happened during the Second Shinobi World War when the graduation age had been dropped to 10. The village needed the funds from missions to maintain the military state during war, and with most Chunin being sent on the battlefield, missions became a priority for available genin, thus resulting in a more intensive academy tuition and an earlier graduation age. Now things had escalated further. He had to acknowledge the rightness of Tsukumo's words, however. Even after observing Kakashi for no more than a few minutes, the boy had clearly mastered what the academy had to offer, and was ready to be placed below a jonin for further development. Minato smiled. You must be very proud, Tsukumo-sensei. Your son lives up to his father's reputation. I'm glad to see he is doing so well. His warm words caused the older man to smile too and nod in agreement, and gratitude for the praise. You've grown too, kid. Why, you're almost as tall as me now. Has Jiraiya been watering you? Minato grinned. You could say so. You're finally taller than Kushina, for one, and by a lot I'd say, the white-haired man continued merrily, and Minato felt his heart skip a bit, eyes widening at the words. Tsukumo's smile mellowed out. She'll be happy to know you're back already, you know. Is she in the village? Afraid not, she's at the IWA border. Got deployed recently as reinforcements to a squad that lost a lot of men. She's doing well, don't fret. In fact, she's one of the few Chunin that are regularly in the village and away from all the fighting, the so-called home defense squad. Her deployment now was more an exception than the norm, as I said. Not enough shinobi to go around. She will be back in no time though, worry not. Minato nodded, filing away any further thoughts on the matter. Having a small force of defending shinobi to protect the village was all well and good, but that role usually fell to the village ANBU. They protected the Hokage and the village itself against any sudden enemies that might penetrate the frontal defense. Having powerful Chunin, such as Kushina, withheld from the battlefield, when there was a need for men was odd, and in line with certain suspicions he had harbored for a long time. He cast the thought aside for now and was just about to thank the man for reassuring him when he felt the wisps of a well-concealed chakra signature down the path. He whirled around just in time to see an ANBU land before him and Tsukumo on one knee. Tsukumo Hatake and Minato Namikaze, your presence has been requested by the Hokage immediately. Thank you, we will meet with him right away, the white-haired man said, adopting the serious expression of a seasoned war veteran. With a last glance at the silver-haired boy, Minato leaped up in the tree branches and sped up towards the Hokage tower. 5 pairs of eyes fixed on Minato and himself as they entered the Hokage office, and somehow Tsukumo just knew something had happened, something bad. He quickly scanned the room, glancing from one face to another. Jiraiya was leaning against the wall with a harsh look, while Shikaku Nara stooped over the Hokage's desk, now full of scrolls and maps. Shikadai's son had proven himself to be an ingenious strategist in his father's absence. Sandaime himself bore a cold look under furrowed eyebrows, urgency seeping in his voice as he turned back to the ANBU kneeling before him. Assemble the squad by tomorrow morning at the latest and set out immediately. Dismissed, he said with a harsh ring in his tone, and the man left with a quick nod. Only then did Hiruzen Sarutobi turn towards the 2 newcomers, tired eyes fixing first on him and then on Minato, look lingering on the blond boy for longer than usual. The white-haired man glanced at the Chunin openly as well, noting narrowed eyes and stiff posture. He too had sensed something was afoot. Hokage-sama, Minato said quietly, inclining his head again in respect for the village's leader. His voice was very different than the warm manner in which they had conversed mere minutes ago, quiet, but clear. It was a voice able to hold attention, a voice able to influence, a voice able to command. I trust you have managed to rest from your travels, Minato-kun, the Hokage began, and Minato nodded in return. I wished I could have welcomed you in a friendlier manner, but the time and circumstances won't allow it. As it is, I have called you both for a mission. I received a report less than an hour ago that a fresh wave of reinforcements has been sent out against our shinobi at the IWA border. The man paused before turning to Shikaku and the dark-haired man sighed. The enemy's intel has been thorough. Their men seem to be headed towards our most weakened squad. Fending them off without reinforcements will be hard. Iwa's likely to try breaching our line and pushing into our land, and with the cut supply lines, Squad 15 of our 3rd Division is currently weakly supplied and suffering a loss of men, barely holding off their ground as it is. Sakumo's eyes widened as he felt the air rush out of him in a huff. Squad 15. But that's Hisashi Kushina. He suddenly understood why they were called in such a short notice, and why this was causing such panic already. It wasn't just about the men that would perish at the hands of the increased IWA forces. It was the village's Jinchuriki that was at stake, and perish she would. He knew it already, for Kushina would never abandon her friends even if it meant her life. From the corner of his eyes he saw recognition enter Minato's look as he took into account the white-haired man's reaction. Every squad within radius is facing a similar threat in their own turn and is unable to aid them without leaving territories unprotected, according to the information we last received. The reinforcements should be somewhere here, the black-haired man said and tapped a finger on the map, indicating a rocky isolated pass in the mountains between the lands of fire and earth. Our men were pushed back to here, right before the mountain pass. The IWA relief should be there sometime tomorrow evening or during the night. It's safe to assume they'd attack sometime later. My bet would be the late hours of the night after going over their own formations and plans. If reinforcements of our own are to leave right away and move at top speed, they can reach the mountain pass by morning the day after tomorrow. We can only hope that Squad 15 will be able to hold out until then, although, Sakumo gulped. He knew the odds. He had been following the situation with Squad 15 ever since his 2 students had been sent as a part of the reinforcement unit. Hisashi, recently appointed Jonin, had assumed control, trying to make use of their limited resources, and Kushina had been stationed as one of their few remaining defensive shinobi. Knowing how ill-supplied they were and how unprepared to meet long-ranged attacks, IWA would probably resort to long-range offensive, as they were known to do, and Kushina would be the only one to stand between their attacks and her squad. And she wouldn't back down. I've ordered the formation of a reinforcement squad as soon as possible, Hiruzen Sarutobi said quietly, but most men are currently away from the village, returning later today or during the night. The full assembly will take too long and at the moment time is of the essence. I'll leave right away. Sakumo stepped up, not caring if the Hokage needed him as an advisor right now. To his surprise, however, Sandaime nodded. That's why I have called you, Sakumo. You and Minato are to depart immediately for the Tokatsukai Pass to aid our men and hold the enemy back until our own reinforcements arrive and push them back. From what little intel we have, I'm afraid the odds wouldn't be good. They are like to outnumber you at least 4-1, Minato. I hear from Jiraiya that you have perfected a few techniques of your own that will be helpful when facing greater numbers. The boy nodded again. Yes, Hokage-sama. With Sakumo-san's help we should be able to defeat them easily enough. The Hitaki found himself looking at the blonde curiously once again. There was no arrogance or conceit in his voice, only conviction, as if he had stated an obvious fact. A snicker broke the following silence and looks directed at Jiraiya, who spoke up for the first time, a large grin on his face. Knowing you, brat, you won't let Sakumo enjoy even half the pie. Minato frowned in a non-serious manner. You give me too much credit, sensei. The toad Sannin chuckled, but chose to remain silent as the Hokage cleared his throat. Right then, Sakumo Hitaki, Minato Namikaze, I appoint you with the A-rank mission of providing relief for Squad 15 of Division 3 of the Konoha Forces, located at the Tokatsukai Pass. You are to leave immediately after your short preparations and are to remain there until the new squad arrives and takes up their position, escorting the injured shinobi of Squad 15 safely home. When both shinobi nodded, Sandaime turned towards the desk and picked up a scroll, handing it to Minato. Those are medical supplies that might be of use to the medics at the border. Seeing as their supply line has been cut off, speak with Tsunade. She'll provide everything listed down. You'll find her at the hospital. Yes, Hokage-sama, he said, taking the scroll and tucking it in a pocket of his Chunin vest. The Hokage paused briefly before smiling, somewhat sadly. I believe there is no need to tell you that speed is of the utmost importance. The blonde boy nodded again. That will be all then, Minato-kun dismissed. Minato threw a quick glance at Sakumo, having noted that he was the only one being dismissed at this point. Meet you at the northwest gates in half an hour, Sakumo murmured, and Minato nodded before exiting the office. The White Fang sighed. That boy, he began quietly and shot a look at Jiraiya, who just kept grinning at him. How strong has he become, Jiraiya? Strong enough, the Sannin said cryptically through a grin. The Jonin's lips twitched in a smile before he directed a look at the Hokage. I suppose you have another mission for me. Indeed. I want you to observe Minato Namikaze's every action during this mission. You'll have to be his chief evaluator. I expect you to assess his progress, determine his rank and report to me. Tsukumo nodded. He had expected as much. War left little time for official tests. Field promotions were standard protocol. And one more thing, the aged man before him said and paused, eyes narrowing in a heavy look, bring her back, Tsukumo. Regardless of her physical condition, I should have never deployed her on the front lines. I fear that IWA might have chosen to attack her squad for other reasons than convenience. If she falls in enemy hands, this might be the end of Konoha. So this is it, kid? Jiraiya asked through a mild smile, leaning casually at the gate, a backpack of his own in one hand. He was leaving as well, having felt as if this nasty situation was partially his fault. If he had checked in with his informants on time instead of detouring home, he might have found out about Iwa's reinforcements much earlier, giving Sandaime more time to plan an effective defense. He sighed inwardly, knowing that he had stalled enough. It was time to leave. His eyes directed to his student again. Minato's smile was ever warm, but the Sannin could see the subtle sadness hidden underneath it all, now mixing with agitation for the situation at hand. He had been the one to teach him how to hide his emotions after all. He could still read the boy well enough. No, he thought suddenly with a tint of pride, not a boy anymore, a man. You say it with such finality, Jiraiya-sensei, the blond man said in a scolding manner. I shall expect to see you soon enough, as long as you don't lose your head in those bathhouses. Bah! As if I'd choose to visit before enjoying a nice bath devoted to my research, his sensei said through a grin. You hold yourself high, brat. The boy shook his head with a smile. If you continue in that particular area of research, you won't have another choice but to return, with a room at the Konoha hospital. You won't have me saving you this time after all. Such insolence! Jiraiya scoffed but then grinned again. It would appear I have taught you well. Indeed you have, sensei, Minato said through yet another smile made of warmth, and for the first time, extended a hand for farewell. Thank you. Jiraiya stared for a few seconds before grinning back and slowly shaking his hand, acknowledging Minato Namikaze as an equal. What's the situation? She asked, squinting through the darkness. They are spreading out in formation. It should begin soon, Hizashi Hyuga whispered from her right in a strained voice, following the enemy's movements closely through his Byakugan. His eyes were easily able to observe the IWA troops across the field, even behind their trenches, with little difficulty, despite the pressing darkness. Kushina nodded, thanking inwardly that she had been deployed along with her teammate. She had learned to rely on him and his invaluable dojutsu, knowing that in this situation it had been his skill that had given them enough time to set up a decent defense. Well, as decent as it could be, under the circumstances. It was nearing dawn now. Squad 15 had fallen near silent, having taken their positions in the trenches and preparing for the inevitable attack. With only a few people still going around and making final preparations, everything around them was still to the point of being unnerving. She felt her throat tighten, knowing well that they stood little chance as things were right now. If IWA attacked, they could barely hold the pass, much less defeat them, and with no reinforcements of their own being spotted, the battle was pretty much pre-decided. That didn't stop her from burning with grim determination, same as her fellow comrades. They would hold the line as long as they could and die for it if they had to, taking down with them as many IWA opponents as they could. A part of her kept pondering what her death would mean for Konoha, with her circumstances being a bit more complicated. She tossed the thought aside. Right now she was not a Jinchuriki, she was a shinobi protecting her village and her people. She glanced to her left quickly and a scowl shadowed her face, cursing inwardly at the horrible situation that presented itself in the young boy by her side. It was one thing for her to die, but Kamuri Sarutobi, he was just a kid, barely having made Chunin at 14 and already deployed to the front after his own insistence. Kushina could only guess how Sandaime might have felt upon having to send out his eldest son to the battlefield. But Kamuri was a shinobi of Konoha now, who had as much right to defend it as anyone else. Heck, some could say even more. With his relation to the Hokage, it wasn't like the boy wasn't skillful, but he was inexperienced and much too hyped for battle, underestimating his enemy's potential and overestimating his own. And if Kushina had learned anything from this war, it was that such self-confidence and vehemence led to an early end. She gulped. Kamuri was a sweet boy, even if he was a boisterous loudmouth. He was passionate about his village, much like his own father, much like her. It was too early for him to go, before having tasted so much of life. The boy felt her look and turned to her with a smile. giving her a thumbs up. Her own smile was strained, but he didn't seem to notice. Turning back to peer into the darkness, and try to make out the enemy's line, she clenched her fist involuntarily, vowing to herself that if she could, she would protect this boy, that if anyone should live from Squad 15 it would be him. Footsteps came from behind them and they all turned to look at the light-haired man approaching them quietly. Long hair pulled back in a ponytail, he kneeled next to them, tired look marring a pale face, and even in the dim light Kushina could make out the deep shadows under his eyes. Last-minute checkups, is everyone okay? Do you need a mend-up? He asked through a dry, hoarse voice, and Kushina had to wonder how many people he had managed to heal in his current state. He was most likely running on willpower alone right now, having depleted his chakra to minimum levels. What was worse, Dan Kato wasn't a medic. No one there was. IWA had done a brilliant job at picking off their medics first. Dan was the only one left who at least knew some of medical ninjutsu, and was doing his best to put it to good use. Even if it cost him abnormal amounts of chakra, the man not having mastered chakra efficiency for complex medical techniques. But his help was vital, and he had taken it to heart. The red-haired girl shook her head quickly, along with Hizashi and Kamuri. Your chakra levels are dangerously low, Dan. Take a soldier pill, Hizashi said quietly, having noticed the obvious through his Byakugan. Dan shook his head. With the supply line cut off, we're running low on these as it is. I will need them for trying to heal people after the battle, he said, and Kushina frowned. She bit her tongue against what she thought they were all thinking. There likely wouldn't be an after the battle. And if there was, she expected heavy injuries that Dan probably wouldn't be able to handle, not even with baskets of soldier pills at hand. Good luck, stay alive and all that, don't cause me too much work afterwards, Dan said through a smile and stood up to walk further down the line. Well, if they were dead they wouldn't cause work anyway. Her throat tightened with the bitter thought, and she felt a stab of guilt. An image of a blond boy appeared before her eyes, smiling warmly as he always had, a distant memory from a carefree childhood. A treasured memory, a promise. Would he know if she died now? Would he be angry with her for breaking their promise? Would he mourn her? Questions flooded her mind, along with regret and sadness. Yes, she would die for her village if she must, but she had wanted, oh how much she had wanted, to at least see her friends smile one last time. Kushina-san, Kamuri's quiet voice came from beside her, snapping her out of her thoughts, and she directed a look at the young boy. He was grinning. Will you go out on a date with me? She laughed. As absurd as the situation was, she couldn't help but laugh at the child's persistence. He had taken a liking to her from the very first day since he had joined Squad 15, and they had become good friends. His childish question was directed at her every now and then, and she would usually ruffle his hair or flick his forehead telling him that he has to grow up a few more years before asking women such questions. He would always pout and claim to be a man grown already. Despite reaching up to her shoulder, her chest tightened. Tell you what, Kamuri-kun, after this battle, when we are back in Konoha, I will go out on a date with you. The boy's eyes widened. Really? I promise. Kamuri whooped joyfully, throwing a victorious fist in the air. All right. Let's get this over with. I have a date, yo. The child said excitedly with a grin. Kushina only smiled. If this promise kept him alive, then she would promise it all over again. I will take you to Aikure, he began, but a hand from Hizashi cut him off, silencing both of them immediately. Kushina felt the chill running through her body, the familiar tension before an upcoming battle already nestled in her stomach. Hizashi made a high tooting whistle twice. The signal. They were moving out. Fire coursed through her body, chakra swirling at her fingertips, senses sharpened to the world around. Kamuri had paled next to her, sweat trickling down his forehead. It was his first open field battle, she realized, and quickly found herself wishing she had given him more advice. It was too late for that now. The quiet sound of light footsteps up ahead reached her ears. They were approaching rapidly, nearly reaching a distance suitable for the first wave of attacks. The long-range ones. Her body tensed. So it begins. Smoke was rising up ahead through the dusk, drifting from the distant battlefield. Shikaku had been right. The battle had already begun during the night. Minato sped up, hands clenching into fists, as he prayed silently that they hadn't been too late. Beside him Tsukumo sped up as well with a grim determination in his eyes. They had run for more than a day now, taking only small breaks to regain strength before dashing again. The older man's stamina was good, but his speed was considerably slower, and the blonde found himself slowing down to match the Jonin's speed. As urgent as the situation was, he knew he needed Tsukumo to counter the enemy forces efficiently. Even so, their pace had been good and they were nearly there. Only a few miles away. It happened out of nowhere. A bright light erupted far ahead, momentarily engulfing the horizon in blinding intensity. Minato and Tsukumo both stopped abruptly, perching on branches and covering their eyes with a hand. Then followed the blast, a deafening roar that could only indicate an explosion of dangerous proportions. Branches and leaves snapped as the blast wave hit them even at such a distance, whooshing past and leaving a frightening calm behind, ears ringing from the sound. Kushina. The name rolled off his tongue without him thinking, and then release. The weight seals etched across the skin of his ankles released with a sizzle and he shot ahead forward, a blur through the trees, leaving the other Jonin well behind. Please let me make it in time. Her adamantium chains rattled as another shaft of explosive kunai hit the barrier. Going off behind the protective chakra wall, Kushina felt the drain in her chakra stocks almost immediately, each blow having turned almost palpable, sapping her of strength. Sweat trickled down her forehead and her neck, her breathing turning labored as she fought the trembling in her hands. Her barrier stood tall, showing no sign of her weakened state. She'd hold it in place until her last breath. She was the only defense shinobi left to their squad, and she'd be damned if she didn't do her job well. Despite having the advantage in numbers, the enemy had stopped just within range for distant attacks and was now mercilessly flinging techniques at the chakra wall that she had extended to protect her comrades. Where the trenches and sparse earth walls weren't enough, chakra chains were shooting out of both her arms, hanging in the air before them, tangled messily, forming an invisible barrier between the two armies. It was a powerful defense, but it also required abnormal quantities of chakra that only an Uzumaki could afford. Even so, she was starting to run low. Water, fire, lightning and even wind techniques battered at the barrier, mixed with explosive kunai that all diminished her strength further, and the drain on her chakra stocks soon turned into physical pain. A new stab with every attack she repelled. They wanted to drain her, she realized, attacking from a distance on purpose to neutralize their only defensive shinobi before they moved in for an open clash. Hizashi had tried sending a small team to flank them while they were at it, but their men had been intercepted, pinning them back in place. That left them with long-range attacks in their own turn, but Iwa's Doton barriers blocked their attempts well enough. Another round of explosive kunai hit the barrier, blasting against it with a dull echo, the sound as if coming from underwater somewhere far off, but she felt the energy drain. Chakra chains rattling as it went, she gritted her teeth, leg wobbling, causing her to drop down on one knee. Kushina Nichin! Kamuri shouted from somewhere beside her. I'm fine, Kamuri-kun, keep your eyes on the enemy, she growled and felt the fire coursing through her muscles as she pushed to get back up. Kushina, this is absurd, drop this barrier, you're running out of chakra already. Let us dodge their attacks as best we could, force them into close combat and defeat as many as we can. You can't protect us forever, this is a stalemate. They won't stop until your chakra is spent, Hizashi said quickly, flinging a set of explosive kunai at the enemy, the blades passing effortlessly out of her barrier. It had taken her a while, but she had learned how to make it one-sided. They have the advantage of numbers, you know. She shouted back over the sound of the battle. If I drop it, they'll force us to dodge and separate us. They'll take us out individually, you know, we won't be able to hold the pass. At least this way we're buying time for reinforcements to arrive. They're not coming, Kushina. Save what chakra you have left and let us fend them off. The Hyuga said before nearing her with a stern look. Need I remind you what will happen if you fall? You should flee before it's too late. Konoha can't afford to lose you, he hissed in a lower voice, unheard by those around her. Anger sparked within her, along with indignation. I'm not running away, you know. There are innocent people whose lives depend on us, Hizashi. If IWA break through and invade, they'll slaughter anyone in their path, shinobi or not. Hizashi's nostrils flared. This is about more than just a goddamn mountain pass. I will not back down, Hizashi. Anger was swirling within her, revitalizing her with its spark, clouding her vision near red. Having her team know of her circumstances was inevitable, but the way they treated her at times, as if she was a tool rather than a fellow shinobi, was enough to make her lose her calm. Her thoughts jumped to the fox uninvited now, temptation zinging on the inside before she quickly shut it down. Yes, the fox was a giant mass of chakra, but it was also an entity consumed by hatred and malevolence. She couldn't control it. Attempting to draw on its chakra now would most likely cost her comrades' lives instead of protecting them. Hisashi drew himself up at full height beside her, and she somehow knew what would follow even before he began. Kushina Uzumaki, as Squad 15's commander, I command you to. He started before stopping midway, hearing the sudden hush. As if on cue, all of the IWA shinobi ceased attacks, a deathly quiet settling over their front line, unsettling enough to cause goosebumps to crawl down Kushina's spine. She fixed the opposite sight with an uneasy look, same as her teammate beside her, squinting to see through the dust. It was already dawn, the first sunrays illuminating the horizon, making it easier to make out their enemy line. A black-haired man stepped in front of the other IWA shinobi, his long red cloak flapping in the wind. Below it he wore a standard shinobi uniform, and a Wagakure forehead protector strapped to his arm. She didn't know why his presence suddenly filled her with dread, calm demeanor and small smirk causing her to tense up. He raised his arms, forming seals, and Kushina felt panic surge through her, feeling already the upcoming attack, knowing that it would be different in magnitude. This man hadn't attacked until now. He had waited long enough for her to be at her weakest. A white small ball appeared in the man's hands, seemingly constructed of nothing more but energy and chakra. A light transparent triangular shape surrounded it, with its tip pointed towards the barrier. Her eyes widened just as Hisashi sucked in a breath beside her. They knew this technique. They knew this bloodline. There were few who didn't. Retreat, the Hyuga shouted at the same time as the Tsuchikage's son shouted Jintan, Genkai Hakuri no Jutsu, and flung the technique towards her barrier. Too slow, she thought as she saw the pulsating ball of chakra flying towards her. Too slow, as her comrades barely managed to jump back, some of them rooted to the spot with confused expressions on their faces. Too slow, as Kamuri yanked on her arm before Hisashi wrapped an arm around his torso and pulled him back, shouting at her to move. The compressed energy ball hit her barrier with such intensity that Kushina fell to her knees, feeling the chains rattling under it, bending, giving in. Her energy melting with her attempt to hold them in place. The chakra barrier shone bright in the morning light as the technique collided with it with a clear high ring. And then the world exploded into a blinding white light. She felt the blast wave pick her up, everything spinning around her madly, making her lose all sense of direction and time. The next thing she knew was silence. Blissful, peaceful silence engulfed her along with a feeling of timelessness. She dimly remembered a fight, a barrier, a blast. It all seemed so far away. Feeling returned to her limbs gradually and the feeling of weightlessness disappeared, making her far too aware of her heavy limbs, tangled in a weird angle below her. She was lying sideways on a cold stony surface, bits of crumbling rock biting uncomfortably in her side, body thumping with pain. Warm liquid was coming down her face. Sweat? No, blood. Muffled noises began reaching her, as if echoes from a distant crowd, and she frowned again. Was the battle over? Did they think her dead? She opened her eyes slowly, taking in the blurred sights. Much too bright for her liking, she blinked, now starting to make out shapes. Figures moving in a blur before her eyes, clashing and falling back again. A bright flame erupted several feet away from her, and a part of her mind, the drilled shinobi part within her, recognized it as a fire technique. She took a few shallow breaths and attempted to move her hands below her, to push herself up despite the wounds. Her limbs felt numb and heavy, as if they were not her own, and she recognized the sign of severe chakra depletion. She could barely move. The mere effort sent fresh waves of fire through her ribcage, and she groaned, realizing that she had broken more than one rib. With a shallow cry she pushed herself up on her elbows, ignoring the screaming protest of her every joint. A wave of dizziness and nausea overwhelmed her, head swimming with each move. She had been thrown several feet back from where she had been standing before, with a small crater now existing where the man's Jintan had collided with her barrier. The earth around it had cracked and shattered with the blast, turning the entire battlefield into a shock of upturned jagged rocks and unconscious bodies sprawled in between. Silent tears streamed down her face without her knowing it as she made out a few Konoha forehead protectors lying ragged on the ground. The remaining shinobi had jumped to battle, fighting in close combat for once. They kept jumping around and meeting more than one opponent at once in a last desperate attempt to hold the pass against the oncoming enemies, their shouts somewhat muffled all about. She raised a hand to her one ear instinctively, feeling blood. A silent curse rang through her head, aimed at the dark-haired man who had reduced her to such a state. As if having heard her morbid thoughts, the very same shinobi appeared before her, a good distance away. His eyes sought her out and locked with hers, and the only thing she saw in them was cold determination. She, the defense shinobi, was his target, and he hadn't finished his job just yet. He took a step towards her and then froze as another person appeared right before her out of nowhere, blocking his path. Kushina blinked, not having felt him approaching. She looked up and squinted, feeling dizziness tugging at her. Blonde hair and a gray tracksuit, a smiling sunny boy, her savior. She shook her head, blinking furiously to clear her vision. No, she realized with a start. No, it's not him, he's not here. This boy was a different boy, in a different time. His hair was brown, and he was not smiling. An angry scowl had twisted his face, a trickle of blood coming down the side of his forehead and cheek. His hands were clenched in fists, and his breathing was coming out in harsh pants. Komuri Sarutobi, recognition finally set in, and with it, horror. What was he doing here? Why hadn't he run away? She opened her mouth to say something, but the only sound was a hoarse whisper, a choke. Her throat felt raw. Not a step further, bastard! The boy yelled, if you want her, you'll have to go through me. And with this he spread his arms before her, shielding her from whatever may come. No, she breathed, fighting her own exhaustion, trying to get up, to push the boy aside. No, Komuri, run. I will protect you, Kushina-nichan, the boy said with fierce determination. No, please, please, Komuri, run away, you know. For the love that you bear me, run away. Her voice was picking up as she saw the man before them smirk and lift his arms again, forming seals. This was not how it was supposed to be. She was supposed to protect him. I'm sorry, Kushina-nichan, but I can't allow you to die now. And he turned towards her with a grin. You finally promised me a date after all. Jin-tun, Genkai Hakuri no Jutsu. Came the now familiar shout as a smaller white sphere shot out towards Komuri, sure to wipe out both of them at once. No! Kushina shouted, a terrified shriek, muffled by the shouts of war. She reached out a hand, pushing herself up regardless of her weariness, moving on willpower alone. Her movement was clumsy, sluggish, slow. She stumbled halfway up and fell to her knees. Forced to stare in horror as the white chakra sphere flew towards Komuri to kill, she felt the tug of the fox's chakra beneath the surface, waiting to be released with the pain. She wanted to close her eyes, to look away, but she couldn't. She owed him that much. This was his choice, his sacrifice. For her, time hadn't slowed down, but her brain ticked faster with adrenaline having rushed in, and she saw the ball approaching with crystal clarity, feeling the surge of power as it flew straight at Komuri's face. It never hit. With a subtle ring the sphere stopped as if having hit an invisible barrier, and a web of kanji expanded in thin air before it, blocking its trajectory. A seal, Kushina realized through incredulity, staring at the complicated mixture of symbols extending like a star from the center of the seal where the Jin-tun sphere had hit. She had never seen anything like it. Instead of repelling it, the seal slowly sucked the ball into nothingness with a whoosh. Did it consume energy? That was even more taxing than simply blocking it. A blast from somewhere far off behind made her turn back just in time to see the dying explosion in the distance. She blinked. A space-time barrier then? Did it just teleport the entire blast? Impossible. The air beside her stirred as someone shunshined next to her, and she turned quickly to see a shock of white hair. Tsukumo-sensei? She breathed, looking at the man's frantic expression. Relief gripped her. Reinforcements had arrived. Kushina, he said, voice laced with worry, don't move, I'll get you out of here. A thudding sound drew her attention back to the battlefield just in time to see a score of kunai embedding themselves in the ground ahead of her and Komuri, even as a rain of them fell towards the fighting armies. Wind chakra-coated blades fixing amongst the rocks with little difficulty, sporadically thrown across the entire field. She scowled at the nearest one. It was the first time she saw such kunai, a very unusual, impractical design. They were all three-pronged. A seal was wrapped around their handles, and she squinted trying to make it out with little success. While the first score of such kunai seemed to fall freely with no particular aim, the last one had pinpointed the Jin-tun user mercilessly, and forced him to jump back with an incredulous look. Another one was already flying to the place where he was retreating, embedding itself in the ground right next to him. It's useless. Such a pathetic attack cannot, he began and froze, eyes bulging, staring ahead without seeing. Before Kushina could realize what was happening, he coughed out blood and sagged to his knees just as the air behind him stirred with a glimpse of yellow. The man fell forward, motionless, a kunai protruding from the back of his neck. What Kushina began in a weak voice before every noise in her throat died out. Zap, 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 zap. A shower of gold rained before her eyes as she saw the same glimpses of yellow appear almost simultaneously throughout the field. IWA shinobi falling dead or dying all about. Kushina stared, unable to comprehend what was happening. She threw an incredulous look at her sensei, who seemed to be just as shocked as she was, staring wide-eyed at the battlefield before him, his worry all but forgotten. She looked back, willing her numbed senses into control. It was a person, she soon realized with incredulity, seeing glimpses of a kunai, a foot, an arm. Whoever it was, he was moving at an incredulous speed, too quick to follow, his movements being erratic, irregular, chaotic, flashing at one part of the field for a second before disappearing with a flash to the other, impossible to track. The IWA shinobi stopped their advance in confusion, unable to understand what was happening, some of them already retreating in horror. They tried to regroup, only to be broken again as a quiet zap stirred the air in between them. They turned to face a spark of yellow before being thrown back in a blast of wind, a futon technique. Kushina recognized as she saw the miniature cuts that the air wave had made in the shinobi's clothing and skin. Someone shouted in horror and broke into a run, followed by others, under rash orders of retreat and regroup. Before long the remaining attackers had fallen back to the mouth of the mountain pass, having formed an uncertain line, looking in every direction frantically, trying to identify their attacker. Their side of the field was now empty, save for the corpses of both friends and foes. A lone figure finally materialized before Kushina, Sakumo and Kumuri, standing in a crouch next to a three-pronged kunai. He stood up slowly, picking the kunai up with him, and Kushina felt her heart skip a beat. Blonde hair, the color of summer sun, danced with the wind over a Konoha forehead protector. Blue eyes, filled with liquid fire, glared at the gathered IWA group with cold determination and threat. You will go no further. Mina, too, was all Kushina managed before the emotions, coupled with the chakra exhaustion, overwhelmed her senses and darkness claimed her.